Every parent knows the crushing weight of watching your child go without while you struggle to find work. Mac McAllister sold his last possession yesterday, the toolbox that once built bridges, just to keep his 7-year-old daughter fed for another week. Now he stands outside a corporate tower, watching wealthy executives enter a hiring gala through golden doors he'll never walk through. His clothes are clean but worn, his pride buried beneath desperate necessity. When CEO Aurelia Chen steps from her car, Mac approaches with trembling hands. "Please give me any job, ma'am. I'll do anything." She hires him as a night janitor out of impulse. But while mopping floors, Mac discovers something that could save thousands of lives, cost him everything. His hidden skills as a master welder might be exactly what her failing company needs. The question is, when the corporate world discovers who he really is, will they embrace his genius or crush him for daring to rise above his station? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains of the cramped apartment, casting shadows across the collection of medical bills scattered on Mac McAllister's kitchen table. He sat with his head in his hands, the weight of 43 years, pressing down on shoulders that had once carried steel beams across construction sites. The coffee in his chipped mug had grown cold hours ago, but he couldn't bring himself to move. "Daddy, are you okay?" Rosie's small voice drifted from the doorway. At 7 years old, she had inherited her mother's gentle spirit and Mac's stubborn determination. Her brown hair hung in tangled waves around a face that still carried traces of sleep, but her eyes, those sharp, observant eyes, missed nothing. Mac lifted his head and managed a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just thinking, sweetheart. How are you feeling this morning?" Rosie padded across the linoleum floor in her worn pajamas, the ones with the faded unicorns that Sarah had bought her 2 Christmases ago, before everything changed, before the cancer, before the medical bills that seemed to multiply like weeds in an abandoned garden. "My chest feels tight again," Rosie admitted, climbing onto Mac's lap with the trust that only children possess. "But I drew you something." She pressed a piece of construction paper into his Hansa crayon drawing that made his throat tighten. It showed a stick figure in a hard hat standing on what could generously be called a bridge, with "Daddy at Work" written in uneven letters across the top. Below it, in her careful printing, she had added, "My hero builds things that help people." Mac hugged her close, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo, a small luxury he still insisted on buying, even when everything else got cut from the budget. "It's beautiful, Rosie. Just like you." The truth was, Mac hadn't built anything in 8 months. Not since Meridian Steelworks closed its doors, taking with it not just his job, but the identity he had spent 20 years crafting. He had been more than a welder there. He had been an innovator, developing techniques that made bridge joints stronger and more resilient. His protocols had been adopted by 3 other facilities before budget cuts and overseas manufacturing made his expertise obsolete. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same bridges he had helped design still carried thousands of cars each day, but the man who had strengthened their bones couldn't find work fixing fence posts. Rosie's breathing grew shallow as she settled against his chest, a sound that never failed to spike his anxiety. The pediatric specialist had been clear. Her asthma was manageable with proper treatment, but proper treatment required insurance. Insurance required employment. Employment, it seemed, required miracles. "Daddy, will you get a job today?" Rosie asked, with the innocent faith that children carry like shields against the world's harsh realities. "I'm going to try my best," Mac promised, the words tasting like copper pennies in his mouth. After getting Rosie ready for school, a process that involved 3 puffs from an inhaler they couldn't afford to refill, Mac walked her to the bus stop 6 blocks away. The September morning carried the crisp promise of autumn, but Mac felt only the weight of another day, stretching ahead with no prospects. "Mr. Mac," called Mrs. Rodriguez from her porch. The elderly woman had become an unofficial grandmother to Rosie since Sarah's death, often watching her when Mac had job interviews or was working his occasional cash jobs. "Any luck yesterday?" Mac shook his head, still looking. "That girl needs stability," Mrs. Rodriguez said gently, not unkindly. "And you need to stop carrying the world on your shoulders." If only it were that simple. Mac watched the school bus disappear around the corner, then began his daily pilgrimage through the city's industrial district. His resume, printed on paper that had grown soft from handling, nestled in a folder that had seen better days. 20 years of experience, certifications in 3 different welding techniques, recommendations from supervisors who had genuinely respected his work. On paper, he should have been employable. But paper didn't account for the reality of a shrinking manufacturing sector, or the preference for younger workers who came without the baggage of family obligations. Paper didn't explain why a man with his skills was reduced to begging for minimum wage positions that barely covered rent, let alone medical expenses. By afternoon, Mac had visited 14 businesses. He had shaken hands with managers who looked past him before he finished speaking, filed applications that would disappear into database oblivion, and smiled until his face ached while being told they would keep his resume on file. That's when he saw the banner stretched across the facade of Chen Technologies' downtown headquarters, "Innovation Gala Hiring the Future Today." The building rose 43 stories into the Seattle sky, all glass and steel geometry that caught the late afternoon light like a crystal prism. Through the lobby windows, Mac could see men and women in sharp suits, networking over champagne and canapes, their confident laughter echoing off marble surfaces. This was where the city's technical elite gathered to shape tomorrow's opportunities. Mac knew he didn't belong inside. His best interview, suit the navy blue one, Sarah had helped him pick out years ago, hung in their closet. But it couldn't hide the calluses on his hands or the weariness in his eyes. More importantly, the gala required advance registration and a $50 networking fee that might as well have been $5,000. So he waited by the service entrance, watching delivery trucks and catering staff come and go. The rational part of his mind knew this was futile, but desperation had long ago silenced reason. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, a sleek black sedan pulled up to the building's main entrance. The driver emerged first, followed by a woman who moved with the kind of purposeful grace that suggested she was accustomed to command. Dr. Aurelia Chen was smaller than Mac had expected from the business magazine photos he had seen. At 41, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had fought for every achievement. Her dark hair was pulled back in a sophisticated chignon, and her tailored suit probably cost more than Mac made in a month when he was employed. But there was something in her posterior tension around her shoulders that suggested the weight of significant pressure. Chen Technologies had been her brainchild, built from a small engineering consultancy into a major player in drone manufacturing. The company's focus on humanitarian applications, disaster relief, medical supply delivery to remote areas, environmental monitoring had earned them both acclaim and skepticism from investors who preferred more traditionally profitable ventures. Mac knew this because he had researched every major employer in the city, memorizing their missions and recent developments in the desperate hope that knowledge might substitute for connections. He knew that Chen Technologies was developing next-generation drones capable of operating in extreme weather conditions. He knew their stock price had fluctuated wildly over the past 6 months as the board pressured Dr. Chen to pivot toward military contracts. What he didn't know, as he watched her stride toward the building's entrance, was that Dr. Chen was fighting her own battle for survival. The quarterly board meeting had ended 3 hours earlier, but Aurelia could still hear the voices of the senior partners echoing in her mind. "The humanitarian market is too niche, Aurelia. Our shareholders need to see immediate returns. Military applications would triple our valuation within 18 months. Perhaps it's time to consider bringing in someone with more traditional experience to guide the company's direction." Each suggestion had felt like a small betrayal of the vision that had driven her to build Chen Technologies in the first place. After earning her PhD in aerospace engineering at 28, she had spent 5 years at Boeing, watching brilliant innovations die in committee meetings while executives chased quarterly bonuses. She had founded her company to prove that technology could serve humanity's best impulses, not just its most destructive ones. Now, with the board threatening a no-confidence vote and investors pulling back from their humanitarian drone project, Aurelia wondered if idealism was just another word for commercial suicide. She was so lost in thought that she almost missed the figure standing by the service entrance. Almost. Mac McAllister stood with the careful posture of a man trying to maintain dignity while the world crumbled around him. His jeans were clean but faded, his work boots scuffed but polished. When their eyes met, Aurelia saw something. She recognized the look of someone who had run out of conventional options but refused to surrender. "Excuse me, ma'am," Mac said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I know you don't know me, but I've been looking for work for 8 months. I've got experience with metal fabrication, welding, quality control. I'll do anything, cleaning, maintenance, whatever you need." Aurelia paused. In the span of a heartbeat, she saw not just the man before her, but a reflection of her own situation. Both of them were fighting battles that conventional wisdom said they couldn't win. "What's your name?" she asked. "Mac McAllister, ma'am. I have a daughter who needs—" He caught himself, straightening his shoulders. "I have 20 years of manufacturing experience." Something in his quiet dignity touched a nerve Aurelia thought she had learned to ignore. Perhaps it was the way he led with his qualifications rather than his desperation. Perhaps it was the recognition of a fellow fighter. Or perhaps it was simply that after hours of listening to board members question her judgment, she was ready to make a decision that was entirely her own. "Report to building services tomorrow morning at 6 a.m., she said. "Ask for Miguel Santos. Tell him Dr. Chen hired you for the night maintenance crew." Mac's eyes widened. "Ma'am, I can't thank you enough." "Don't thank me yet," Aurelia interrupted, already questioning her impulsive decision. "It's temporary work, minimum wage. If you're not reliable, you're gone." "You won't regret this," Mac promised. As Aurelia walked toward the building's golden doors, she wondered if that was true. She had just hired a complete stranger based on nothing more than intuition and a moment of shared recognition. In 12 hours, she would be presenting her company's quarterly projections to a room full of skeptical investors, defending innovations that board members considered commercially naive. But for the first time in months, she had made a decision that felt entirely her own. Mac stood by the service entrance until long after Dr. Chen disappeared into the building. The Seattle evening grew cool around him, but he barely noticed. Tomorrow morning, he would have a job. It wasn't the career that would restore his sense of purpose, but it was a paycheck. It was health insurance for Rosie. It was a chance to stop the slow slide toward complete destitution. As he walked, the 6 miles home-saving bus fare for Rosie's inhaler refill, Mac allowed himself something he hadn't indulged in for months: hope. Behind him, 43 stories of glass and steel rose into the darkening sky, housing innovations that could change the world, and corporate politics that could destroy dreams. Mac didn't know that his new employer was fighting her own battle for survival, or that the building he would soon be cleaning contained secrets that could save thousands of lives. He didn't know that within a week, his expert eye would spot flaws that million-dollar engineering teams had missed, or that his improvised solutions would become the foundation for breakthroughs his new colleagues couldn't imagine. All Mac knew, as he climbed the stairs to his apartment where Rosie waited with homework and hope, was that tomorrow he would have somewhere to go. Someone had taken a chance on him when conventional wisdom suggested he was a poor investment. It was enough. For now, it was enough. Mac's first night at Chen Technologies began at 10 p.m. after the building had emptied of its daytime inhabitants. Miguel Santos, the building services supervisor, was a weathered man in his 50s who had worked maintenance for 3 decades. He handed Mac a set of keys and a security badge with practiced efficiency. Dr. Chen says you're reliable, Miguel said, studying Mac with the assessing gaze of someone who had seen too many new hires come and go. Night shift is different. You're mostly alone up there. Labs on floors 30 through 35 need special attention, expensive equipment, sensitive projects. Can you handle that kind of responsibility? Yes, sir, Mac replied, clipping the badge to his uniform shirt. The navy blue polo bore the Chen Technologies logo, a stylized wing that suggested both flight and protection. Miguel led him through the building's maze of service corridors, explaining protocols with the thoroughness of someone who understood that details mattered. Trash gets sorted, regular waste, electronic waste, hazardous materials. Each lab has its own requirements. You see anything suspicious, anything that doesn't look right, you call security immediately. They rode the service elevator to the 32nd floor, where the drone development labs hummed with the quiet energy of machines left running overnight. Through reinforced glass windows, Mac could see workbenches covered with partially assembled aircraft, their carbon fiber frames gleaming under fluorescent lights. These are the prototypes for the humanitarian project, Miguel explained, using his master key to unlock the main lab door. Dr. Chen's baby, supposed to deliver medical supplies to disaster zones, places regular aircraft can't reach. Mac nodded, following Miguel into the climate-controlled space. His trained eye immediately catalogued the workshop's contents: precision welding stations, 3D printers, testing equipment that probably cost more than he had made in his last year of employment. But it was the drones themselves that captured his attention. 6 aircraft sat in various stages of completion, each roughly the size of a small helicopter, but sleeker, more elegant. Their frames showed the distinctive honeycomb pattern of advanced composite materials, designed to be both lightweight and incredibly strong. Mac had worked with similar materials during his bridge-building days, though nothing quite this sophisticated. Beautiful work, Mac murmured, genuinely impressed by the craftsmanship. Dr. Chen designed most of it herself, Miguel said with obvious pride. PhD from MIT, worked at Boeing before she started this company. She's got vision, you know. Wants to use this technology to help people instead of, he caught himself, perhaps remembering that corporate politics weren't appropriate topics for orientation. They moved through the lab methodically, Miguel explaining cleaning protocols and security procedures. Mac listened carefully, but part of his attention remained focused on the drones. Something about their construction nagged at him, though he couldn't immediately identify what. After Miguel left him with a cart full of cleaning supplies and a detailed checklist, Mac began his work alone. The building's nighttime quiet was broken only by the hum of ventilation systems and the occasional click of cooling equipment. For the first time in months, Mac felt useful again, not in the way that had once defined him, but in a way that provided structure and purpose. He worked methodically through the lower floors, emptying trash bins and mopping corridors with the same attention to detail he had once brought to welding specifications. Each task completed was a small victory, a step toward the stability Rosie needed. By 2 a.m., Mac had reached the drone development labs. As he cleaned around the workbenches, he found himself studying the aircraft more closely. The composite frames were impressive examples of modern manufacturing, but something about the joint connections troubled him. Mac set down his mop and moved closer to the nearest prototype, careful not to touch anything. His years of experience reading stress patterns in metal and composite materials had developed into an almost intuitive sense for structural integrity. What he saw made his stomach tighten. Hairline fractures ran along the mounting points where the wing assemblies connected to the main fuselage. They were barely visible, hidden within the honeycomb pattern of the composite material, but Mac's trained eye caught the subtle irregularities that indicated stress concentration. He moved to the next drone. Same problem. The third aircraft showed even more pronounced fracturing, though still at a microscopic level that standard visual inspection might miss. Mac's mind raced through the implications. These weren't random manufacturing defects. They followed a pattern that suggested a fundamental design flaw in the joint system. Under normal operating conditions, the fractures would propagate slowly, potentially leading to catastrophic structural failure during flight. For medical supply drones operating in disaster zones, such failures wouldn't just mean lost equipment. They could mean lost lives, both of the people depending on those supplies and anyone on the ground when the aircraft came down. Mac stood in the quiet lab, torn between professional obligation and personal necessity. Speaking up would mean revealing that he possessed expertise far beyond what his janitor position suggested. It would mean questions about his background, his qualifications, his right to make such assessments. But staying silent could mean watching aircraft launch with fatal flaws, carrying humanitarian missions that would turn into tragedies. He thought of Rosie, asleep in their cramped apartment, depending on the health insurance this job provided. He thought of Dr. Chen, who had taken a chance on a desperate stranger. He thought of the unknown people in disaster zones who might depend on these drones for survival. Mac pulled out his phone and took careful photographs of the fracture patterns, making sure to capture the subtle stress indicators that conventional inspection might miss. He documented the specific locations and orientations of the flaws, his engineer's mind automatically cataloging the data. The sound of footsteps in the corridor made him quickly pocket his phone and return to his cleaning cart. But the footsteps passed without stopping, leaving Mac alone with his discovery and his dilemma. For the remaining hours of his shift, Mac worked with mechanical efficiency while his mind wrestled with the decision before him. By the time dawn light began filtering through the building's windows, he had reached a conclusion that satisfied neither his sense of professional responsibility nor his desperate need for security. He would document everything he had observed, but he would be careful about how and when he revealed it. If the manufacturing team discovered the flaws through their own quality control processes, the problem would be solved without risk to his position. If they didn't, if these aircraft moved toward production and deployment without proper inspection, then he would find a way to speak up. It was a compromise that left him feeling hollow, but it was the best solution he could manage given the circumstances. As Mac prepared to leave the building at 6 a.m., he passed the main lobby, where early arriving executives were already gathering for what appeared to be an important meeting. Through the glass conference room walls, he could see Dr. Chen presenting charts and diagrams to a group of stern-faced men and women in expensive suits. Mac didn't know that he was watching Dr. Chen defend her humanitarian drone project against board members who wanted to pivot toward military contracts. He didn't know that the quarterly investor demonstration was scheduled for the following week, or that the success of that demonstration would determine whether Chen Technologies continued pursuing its humanitarian mission. All Mac knew was that the woman who had given him a chance was fighting some kind of battle, and that the aircraft she believed in carried flaws that could destroy everything she had worked to build. Walking home through the awakening city, Mac carried the weight of knowledge he wasn't sure how to use. In his pocket, his phone held photographs that could save lives or cost him everything. The morning air carried the crisp promise of autumn, but Mac felt only the burden of impossible choices. Back in the 32nd floor lab, 6 prototype drones sat waiting for their next round of testing. Their hairline fractures, invisible to everyone, except a janitor who had once built bridges designed to last a century. The cracked drone frame that would drive the entire story forward had been discovered. Now Mac faced the choice that would define not just his own future, but the fate of Dr. Chen's company and the lives of everyone who would depend on aircraft that might fall from the sky. 3 nights into his new routine, Mac had established a rhythm that felt almost normal. Rosie went to bed at 8, confident that Daddy had work again. Mac arrived at Chen Technologies by 10, methodically cleaned his assigned floors, and returned home by 7 a.m. to get Rosie ready for school. It wasn't the life he had planned, but it was stably. First stability they had known in months. But the fractures haunted him. Each night, Mac found himself drawn back to the drone lab, ostensibly to clean but really to study the prototype aircraft with growing concern. His photographs, reviewed and re-reviewed on his phone, confirmed what his experienced eye had detected: stress, concentration patterns that would lead to catastrophic failure under load. On Thursday night, Mac made a decision that violated every protocol Miguel had outlined. Using his security badge to access the lab after completing his official cleaning duties, he began what he told himself was a more thorough inspection. The lab's equipment inventory included magnifying devices used for quality control inspections. Mac carefully positioned one over the most pronounced fracture line, adjusting the focus until the flaw became clearly visible, a hairline crack that would be invisible to casual inspection, but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. "Jesus," Mac whispered, the engineer in him finally overriding the janitor's caution. He photographed the magnified view, documenting angles and measurements with the precision that had once made him valuable to bridge construction teams. The fracture pattern told a story: inadequate stress distribution at the wing to fuselage connection points, probably caused by a resonance frequency that matched the drone's operational parameters. It was fixable. Mac's mind automatically began developing solutions reinforcement techniques that could distribute stress more effectively, welding protocols that would eliminate the weak points. But fixing it would require admitting that a night janitor possessed engineering expertise that million-dollar development teams had somehow missed. Mac was so absorbed in his analysis that he almost missed the sound of approaching footsteps. He quickly shut off the magnification equipment and grabbed his cleaning supplies, but not before noting the time. 3:17 a.m., well past when he should have finished the lab cleaning. The footsteps passed without pausing, but the close call reminded Mac how precarious his position truly was. He finished his work quickly and returned to the service areas, his mind churning with possibilities and fears. At home, Rosie was having another difficult morning. Her breathing had grown more labored over the past few days, and the rescue inhaler that should have provided relief seemed less effective. Mac watched her struggle through breakfast with growing anxiety, calculating medical costs he couldn't afford, even with his new insurance coverage. "Daddy, will you tell me about the bridges again?" Rosie asked, between careful bites of toast. It had become their routine, Mac, describing the engineering marvels he had once helped create, while Rosie listened with the rapt attention that only children could sustain. He told her about suspension cables that could hold thousands of tons, about foundations that reached deep into bedrock, about joints designed to flex with wind and weather without breaking. "The secret," Mac explained, sitting beside her at their small kitchen table, "is understanding where the stress wants to go. Metal and composites, they have natural patterns. Fight against those patterns, and eventually something breaks. Work with them, and you can build things that last forever." Rosie nodded solemnly, as if storing away wisdom for future use, like how you fix things. Mac's throat tightened. "Something like that, sweetheart." After walking Rosie to her bus stop, Mac found himself unable to sleep despite his exhaustion. The drone fractures occupied his thoughts like an engineering puzzle that demanded solving. He spent the morning researching Chen Technologies' humanitarian mission online, learning about disaster relief protocols and the lives that could depend on reliable aircraft performance. The weight of responsibility grew heavier as he understood the scope of the company's ambitions. These weren't experimental aircraft. They were intended for deployment in earthquake zones, hurricane-ravaged islands, conflict areas where traditional aid delivery was impossible. Failure wouldn't just mean disappointment, it would mean abandoning people who had no other hope. That afternoon, Mac did something he hadn't done since losing his job at Meridian Steel. He visited his storage unit. The monthly fee was another expense he could barely afford, but Mac couldn't bring himself to sell the tools and reference materials that represented 20 years of professional growth. His welding equipment sat under dusty tarps, like artifacts from a previous life. More importantly, his technical library textbooks on metallurgy, composite materials, and structural engineering contained information he needed. Mac pulled out his copy of Advanced Composite Stress Analysis, a dense technical manual he had studied during his certification process years earlier. The mathematical formulas and stress diagrams that had once been second nature now required careful rereading, but the knowledge came back gradually. By evening, Mac had developed a preliminary solution for the drone fractures. It would require a modified welding technique that he had pioneered during bridge construction, a method for creating seamless joints in dissimilar materials. Applied to the wing fuselage connection points, it could eliminate the stress concentration that was causing the hairline cracks. But implementing the solution would require resources and authority he didn't possess. More critically, it would require revealing his true expertise to people who had hired him to empty trash bins. Mac arrived at work that night with a small toolkit hidden in his cleaning cart. Nothing obvious, just basic hand tools that could be explained as maintenance equipment, but also precision measuring devices that would allow him to take accurate readings of the fracture patterns. The building felt different as he worked through his usual routine. Each floor brought him closer to a decision that could change everything for better or worse. By the time he reached the drone lab, Mac's hands were trembling slightly with nervous energy. The lab was empty, as usual, but the aircraft seemed to mock him with their elegant design and hidden flaws. Mac set up his makeshift measuring station using supplies scrounged from the janitorial cart and tools from his personal kit. He worked with practiced efficiency, documenting stress patterns and joint specifications with the thoroughness that had once made him valuable. What he discovered confirmed his worst fears. The fractures were progressing faster than he had initially calculated. Under operational stress, the kind of loads these aircraft would face during emergency missions, catastrophic failure could occur within weeks of deployment. Mac sat back on his heels, staring at measurements that spelled potential disaster. He thought of Rosie sleeping peacefully in their apartment, trusting that Daddy's new job would keep them safe. He thought of Dr. Chen's passionate defense of humanitarian technology. He thought of people in disaster zones who might depend on aircraft that could literally fall out of the sky. The choice was no longer theoretical. These drones would soon move from prototype to production, from testing to deployment. Unless someone spoke up, the flaws would remain hidden until failure occurred in the field, with consequences that could destroy lives and end Dr. Chen's company. Mac made his decision in the quiet of the 32nd floor lab, surrounded by machines that represented humanity's best intentions and engineering's hidden perils. He would find a way to fix the problem himself, quietly and without drawing attention to his expertise. It would require careful planning and considerable risk, but it was the only path that satisfied both his professional conscience and his desperate need for security. He began by identifying the specific tools and materials he would need. The building's fabrication facilities contained everything required for his solution, though accessing them would mean violating security protocols and working far outside his official responsibilities. As dawn approached and Mac prepared to end his shift, he felt the familiar weight of engineering challenges that had once defined his professional life. For the first time in months, he was thinking like the expert he had always been, rather than the desperate job seeker he had become. The makeshift welding setup he would create, from janitorial supplies and scavenged materials, would become the artifact that drove his transformation from invisible janitor to unrecognized savior. But for now, it existed only as careful plans sketched in a notebook that had once contained bridge specifications. Mac walked home through the awakening city, carrying tools and knowledge that could save thousands of lives if he could find the courage to use them without destroying the fragile security he had finally achieved. The stack of medical bills on Mac's kitchen table had grown thicker over the weekend. Rosie's emergency clinic visit on Saturday, triggered by a wheezing episode that wouldn't respond to her rescue inhaler, had added another $400 to their mounting debt. Even with his new insurance coverage, the deductibles and copays stretched their already thin budget to the breaking point. "The specialist wants to see her again next week," Mac explained to Mrs. Rodriguez, who had agreed to watch Rosie during his Monday night shift. "Her asthma is getting worse, and the current medication isn't effective enough." Mrs. Rodriguez nodded with the understanding of someone who had raised 5 children of her own. That girl needs stability, Mac. Medical care, yes, but also the security of knowing her father isn't carrying the world on his shoulders. If only she knew how literally true that had become. Mac arrived at Chen Technologies that Monday night with more than cleaning supplies in his cart. Hidden beneath the industrial-grade trash bags and floor polish were precision tools borrowed from his storage unit, along with composite repair materials he had purchased with money earmarked for groceries. The first 3 hours of his shift preceded normally methodical cleaning of offices and corridors, while he mentally rehearsed the modifications he planned to attempt. But as he approached the drone lab, Mac's resolve wavered. What he was contemplating went far beyond violating company policy. It was essentially unauthorized engineering work on multi-million-dollar prototypes. The rational part of his mind catalogued everything he could lose: his job, his insurance coverage, possibly even criminal charges for property damage. But his engineer's conscience proved stronger than his caution. Mac set up his improvised workstation in a storage alcove adjacent to the main lab, using cleaning supplies to conceal his real tools. His plan was simple in concept but delicate in execution. Create reinforcing joints that would distribute stress away from the fracture points using a modified welding technique that would be invisible to casual inspection. Working by the light of a small LED flashlight, Mac began fabricating micro-reinforcements from scrap composite material found in the lab's waste bins. His hands moved with the muscle memory of 20 years' experience, cutting and shaping with precision that had once built bridges designed to last centuries. The first repair took him 45 minutes, a hairline welding job that strengthened the wing fuselage connection without altering the drone's external appearance. Mac stepped back to examine his work, using a magnifying glass to verify that the stress concentration had been eliminated. It was good work. Better than good, it was the kind of innovative solution that had once made him valuable to construction teams. The reinforcement was nearly invisible but structurally sound, distributing load forces in a way that eliminated the fracture-prone weak points. Mac moved to the second prototype, then the third, working with growing confidence as his skills returned. Each repair was slightly different, customized to the specific stress patterns he had identified. By 4 a.m., he had reinforced 4 of the 6 aircraft. The sound of voices in the main corridor froze Mac mid-weld. He quickly shut off his equipment and concealed his tools, returning to his official cleaning duties just as 2 security guards made their rounds. They nodded politely as they passed, noting nothing unusual about a janitor working late. After they left, Mac allowed himself a moment of genuine satisfaction. For the first time in months, he had used his real skills to solve a meaningful problem. The aircraft were now structurally sound, capable of performing their humanitarian missions without the risk of catastrophic failure. But his satisfaction was short-lived. The next morning brought news that would complicate everything. "Big week coming up," Miguel Santos mentioned during Mac's Tuesday evening briefing. "The quarterly investor demonstration is Friday. Dr. Chen's presenting the humanitarian drone project to potential funders. There's going to be a live test flight-on of the prototypes carrying simulated medical supplies." Mac's blood turned cold. A live demonstration meant public attention, media coverage, and detailed inspection of the aircraft. His modifications, while structurally sound, might not survive close scrutiny by the engineering team. "Which prototype are they using?" Mac asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Unit 4, I think. The one with the blue trim. Dr. Chen's been working on it, personally calibrating the navigation systems, fine-tuning the payload distribution." Unit 4. Mac had reinforced that aircraft 2 nights earlier, but his modifications were concentrated on structural elements that might become visible during pre-flight inspection. If the engineering team discovered unauthorized alterations, the investigation would lead directly back to the night maintenance crew. Mac spent his Tuesday shift in a state of controlled anxiety, methodically completing his cleaning duties, while his mind raced through possible scenarios. He could remove his modifications before the demonstration, returning the aircraft to their original flawed state. He could find a way to anonymously alert the engineering team to the fractures, hoping they would discover and address the problems through official channels. Or he could trust that his repairs were good enough to pass inspection and pray that no one looked too closely. Wednesday brought a new complication. As Mac worked through his routine cleaning of the executive floors, he overheard a heated conversation coming from Dr. Chen's office. "The board is losing confidence, Aurelia," a man's voice was saying. "The military contracts would guarantee profitability. This humanitarian project is admirable, but admirable doesn't pay shareholders." "The humanitarian applications are revolutionary," Dr. Chen replied, her voice tight with frustration. "We're talking about saving lives in disaster zones, delivering medical supplies to areas no other aircraft can reach. That has value beyond quarterly profits. Tell that to the investors," the man responded. "Friday's demonstration needs to be flawless. Any problems, any hint of technical difficulties, and the board will have the excuse they need to force a strategic pivot." Mac lingered outside the office, pretending to clean the same section of corridor while he absorbed the implications. Dr. Chen's entire vision for her company hung in the balance of Friday's demonstration. The aircraft he had secretly repaired would determine not just the success of a business presentation, but the future direction of humanitarian technology. Thursday night's shift carried an electric tension that Mac felt in every routine task. Tomorrow would bring the live demonstration that could vindicate Dr. Chen's vision or destroy it. The prototype aircraft sat in the lab like sleeping giants, their hidden modifications representing either salvation or sabotage. Mac made his final rounds through the drone lab with particular attention to Unit 4. His reinforcements were invisible to casual inspection, integrated seamlessly into the aircraft's existing structure. But under the kind of detailed pre-flight checks that preceded public demonstrations, they might be discovered. As he cleaned around the workbenches, Mac noticed something that made his heart rate spike. Chalk marks on the lab floor, indicating where additional inspection equipment would be positioned for Friday's preparation. The marks suggested a level of scrutiny that would examine every component, every joint, every surface. Standing in the quiet lab surrounded by his secret work, Mac faced the possibility that his attempt to prevent disaster might create a different kind of catastrophe. If his modifications were discovered, the resulting investigation would destroy not just his own precarious position, but potentially Dr. Chen's company as well. Yet removing the reinforcements would return the aircraft to their original flawed state, virtually guaranteeing structural failure during the high-stress demonstration flight. Mac made his choice in the early hours of Friday morning, as the city began to wake and the most important day in Chen Technologies' recent history approached. He would leave his modifications in place and trust that his engineering skills were sufficient to withstand scrutiny. The anonymous janitor fix that would soon spread through the engineering department was about to be put to its ultimate test. In a few hours, Unit 4 would either vindicate Mac's expertise or expose him as an imposter who had overstepped every boundary of his position. Walking home through the dawn-lit streets, Mac carried the weight of consequences he couldn't control. Somewhere in the corporate tower behind him, Dr. Chen was preparing for a demonstration that would define her company's future. Neither of them knew that their fates had become inextricably linked by hairline fractures and midnight repairs, by desperate necessity and professional pride. The medical bills waiting on Mac's kitchen table represented his daughter's immediate needs. But the aircraft sleeping in the 32nd floor lab carried the hopes of disaster victims around the world and the career of a woman who had taken a chance on a desperate stranger. By evening, both Mac's secret and Dr. Chen's company would face judgment that could change everything. Friday morning arrived with the crisp clarity that September often brought to Seattle, but for Mac McAllister, the day felt wrapped in fog. He had managed only 3 hours of sleep after his Thursday night shift, his mind churning through every possible outcome of the demonstration that would begin in just 6 hours. Rosie's morning routine provided a welcome distraction from his anxiety. She chatted about her art project while Mac helped her with breakfast, her innocent enthusiasm a reminder of what truly mattered. But even Rosie's bright spirits couldn't completely mask the labored quality of her breathing. "Daddy, you look worried," she observed with the unsettling perceptiveness that children sometimes displayed. "Is everything okay at your job?" Mac managed a smile that felt more genuine than he expected. "Everything's fine, sweetheart. Just a big day at work, but I'll be home tonight, and we can watch that movie you picked out." After seeing Rosie off to school, Mac found himself unable to settle into his usual pre-shift rest. Instead, he walked the 6 miles to Chen Technologies, arriving hours before his shift began. He told himself it was curiosity about the demonstration preparations, but deeper motivations drove his restless energy. The building buzzed with unusual activity for a Friday afternoon. Catering trucks delivered equipment for what appeared to be an elaborate reception. Media vans gathered in the parking area, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like technological flowers seeking signal. Executive assistants hurried through the lobby, carrying presentation materials and tablet computers. Mac positioned himself at a coffee shop across the street, nursing a cup he couldn't afford, while watching the controlled chaos of preparation. Through the building's glass walls, he could see technicians setting up equipment in the main conference room. Somewhere inside that corporate hive, Unit 4 was being prepared for its moment of truth. At 2 p.m., Mac witnessed Dr. Chen emerging from the building in conversation with a tall man in an expensive suit. Even from a distance, her body language suggested tension, shoulders squared, gestures controlled but emphatic. The man beside her nodded with the patient expression of someone accustomed to managing difficult personalities. Mac didn't know he was watching Dr. Chen's final conversation with the board chairman before the demonstration. He couldn't hear the ultimatum being delivered, flawless performance or forced strategic pivot toward military contracts, but he could see the weight of expectation in her posture as she returned to the building. By 4 p.m., Mac couldn't delay any longer. His shift didn't begin until 10 p.m., but the demonstration would be over. By then his work either vindicated or exposed, his position either secure or terminated. He needed to be inside the building, even if it meant violating protocol. Mac approached the service entrance where he had first pleaded for employment just 2 weeks earlier. The security guard on duty, Johnson, who worked the swing shift, recognized him with a friendly nod. "Early tonight, Mac? Miguel asked me to help with some special cleaning before the demonstration." Mac lied smoothly. "Extra hands for the big event." Johnson waved him through without question, the kind of casual trust that Mac felt like acid in his stomach. He was accumulating deceptions faster than he could justify them, each small violation of protocol building toward a reckoning he couldn't avoid. The building's interior reflected the controlled tension of high-stakes preparation. Mac made his way to the service areas, donning his cleaning uniform and collecting a cart that would provide cover for his real mission, observing the final preparations for Unit 4's demonstration. The 32nd floor hummed with activity that was both fascinating and terrifying to watch. Engineering technicians surrounded Unit 4 with diagnostic equipment, running systems checks that would have been routine for any aircraft, but felt like examinations of Mac's secret work. Mac positioned himself in an adjacent corridor, ostensibly cleaning baseboards, while actually monitoring the inspection process through the lab's glass walls. His heart rate spiked each time a technician examined the wing fuselage connection points where his modifications were concentrated. Dr. Lead Engineer Sarah Voss directed the inspection with the methodical precision that had made her Chen Technologies' most trusted technical expert. Mac watched her run diagnostic scans over every surface, checking stress points with equipment sensitive enough to detect microscopic flaws. "Structural integrity looks excellent," Voss announced to her team. "Better than our initial projections, actually. The composite joints are showing optimal stress distribution." Mac's knees nearly buckled with relief. His modifications weren't just undetected, they were improving the aircraft's performance metrics beyond original specifications. But his relief was premature. "That's interesting," Voss continued, leaning closer to examine one of the connection points. "The stress patterns here are different from our computer models, more efficient actually. Run a detailed scan on this section." Mac felt sweat gathering between his shoulder blades as additional equipment was positioned around Unit 4. The level of scrutiny was exactly what he had feared, detailed enough to reveal that someone had performed unauthorized modifications. The scanning process took 45 minutes that felt like hours. Mac maintained his cleaning routine with mechanical precision while his future hung in the balance just beyond the glass walls. Discovery would mean more than job loss. It could mean criminal charges for tampering with corporate property. "I'm seeing micro-welding patterns that aren't in our fabrication records," one technician reported. "The work is excellent. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing, but it's not documented anywhere in our files." Dr. Voss studied the scan results with growing confusion. "The modifications are structurally sound. Actually, they're brilliant. They eliminate stress concentration points we didn't even know existed. But who could have done work this sophisticated without authorization?" Mac forced himself to continue cleaning while the investigation intensified around Unit 4. Additional engineers arrived to examine the mysterious modifications, their voices carrying a mixture of admiration and concern. "This is master-level work," one engineer admitted. "The technique is beyond anything in our standard protocols. But if someone made unauthorized changes to a prototype aircraft, the implications hung unspoken in the air. Corporate security would be called. Access logs would be reviewed. The investigation would inevitably lead to the night maintenance crew and the new janitor who had been working alone in the labs. Mac made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of fleeing, he moved closer to the lab entrance, positioning himself where he could overhear more of the technical discussion. If his work was about to be exposed, he wanted to understand exactly how his modifications would be judged. "The welding technique is unlike anything I've seen, Doctor," Voss was saying. "It's almost like someone took our standard protocols and evolved them, improved them in ways that suggest decades of experience with composite stress analysis. Could this be related to the anonymous suggestions we've been receiving?" another engineer asked. "Someone's been leaving detailed technical notes about various projects, always accurate, always helpful, but never signed." Mac's eyes widened. He hadn't been leaving notes, but apparently someone else had been making unofficial contributions to Chen Technologies' engineering challenges. The revelation suggested that his own unauthorized modifications might be part of a larger pattern of mysterious assistance. Dr. Voss stepped back from the aircraft, her expression thoughtful. "The demonstration begins in 90 minutes. These modifications don't compromise the aircraft's safety, they improve it. We proceed as planned, but I want a full investigation into who's been making these changes." As the engineering team shifted their focus to final systems checks, Mac retreated to a supply closet to steady his nerves. His modifications had passed inspection, not just as acceptable, but as improvements to the original design. The anonymous janitor fix had earned professional admiration from experts who would never have imagined that their mystery helper was emptying their trash bins each night. But the investigation Dr. Voss had ordered would examine security badge scanner logs, digital records that would reveal Mac's after-hours presence in restricted areas. His badge, number 2847, had been used to access the labs during times when no maintenance work was scheduled. Mac pulled out his security badge, studying the magnetic strip that contained his digital identity within Chen Technologies' system. Somewhere in the building's computer servers, that badge had left an electronic trail leading directly to him. The demonstration would begin in less than 2 hours. Unit 4 would either perform flawlessly, vindicating both Dr. Chen's vision and Mac's secret contributions, or suffer the kind of catastrophic failure that would destroy both their futures. But regardless of the aircraft's performance, Mac's unauthorized presence in the labs had been recorded by systems designed to track every movement within the building. The badge scanner logs that would soon expose his nighttime activities represented evidence that no amount of successful demonstration could erase. Walking through the building's corridors as preparation continued around him, Mac carried the weight of approaching revelation. In a few hours, he would either be celebrated as an anonymous savior or arrested as a corporate saboteur. The digital trail of his security badge access would determine which outcome awaited him. The Chen Technologies conference room had been transformed into a showcase of corporate ambition. 200 investors, board members, and media representatives filled theater-style seating, arranged to face floor-to-ceiling windows that offered an unobstructed view of the building's rooftop landing pad. Unit 4 sat gleaming in the afternoon sunlight, its composite frame reflecting the kind of technological sophistication that inspired both confidence and substantial financial investment. Mac watched the gathering from a service corridor, his janitor's uniform making him invisible among the catering staff who moved efficiently through the crowd. Dr. Chen stood at a podium, positioned to command the room's attention. Her presentation materials displayed on screens that faced both the live audience and remote viewers, joining via video conference. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Chen began, her voice carrying the controlled confidence that had built Chen Technologies from startup to industry leader. "Today marks a pivotal moment in humanitarian technology. The aircraft you see behind me represents 5 years of development and the potential to save thousands of lives in disaster zones worldwide." Mac felt a surreal disconnection from the polished presentation. The woman speaking about revolutionary technology had no idea that a desperate janitor had secretly modified her prototype aircraft. The investors evaluating multi-million-dollar opportunities couldn't imagine that their potential returns depended partly on unauthorized midnight repairs. "Our humanitarian drones can deliver medical supplies to areas traditional aircraft cannot reach," Dr. Chen continued, clicking through slides that showed theoretical deployment scenarios. Earthquake zones with damaged infrastructure, hurricane-ravaged islands cut off from supply lines, conflict areas where ground transportation is impossible. Mac's attention shifted between Dr. Chen's presentation and his phone, where Mrs. Rodriguez had texted an update about Rosie's condition. His daughter's wheezing had worsened during the school day, requiring a visit to the nurse's office and an early pickup. The rescue inhaler that should have provided relief was becoming less effective, a progression that worried both Mac and Rosie's pediatrician. The stress analysis shows optimal performance under extreme weather conditions. Dr. Chen was explaining, gesturing toward technical diagrams that Mac could interpret better than most of the investors in the audience. "Our composite frame design provides unprecedented strength-to-weight ratios." Mac knew those stress analysis reports were based on his modifications, though Dr. Chen didn't realize it. His unauthorized reinforcements had eliminated the fracture points that would have made the demonstration a catastrophe rather than a triumph. The presentation moved toward its climax as Dr. Chen introduced the live flight demonstration. Unit 4 will now perform a simulated emergency supply run, carrying medical equipment equivalent to what disaster relief teams require in the field. Mac watched Dr. Voss and her engineering team conduct final pre-flight checks through the conference room windows. Their movements suggested routine confidence, but Mac could see the subtle signs of unusual attention, extra time spent examining the connection points where his modifications were concentrated. "Dr. Chen," called out a voice from the audience. Man Mac recognized as board chairman Robert Winters from the company website photos. "The board remains concerned about the commercial viability of humanitarian applications. Military contracts would provide more reliable revenue streams." Dr. Chen's pause lasted only a fraction of a second, but Mac caught the tightness around her eyes that suggested this was not an unexpected challenge. "Mr. Winters, today's demonstration will show that humanitarian technology can achieve the performance standards that make military applications possible, while serving purposes that align with our company's founding vision." It was a diplomatic, non-answer that acknowledged the political pressures without conceding the argument. Mac understood that he was watching more than a technical demonstration. He was witnessing a battle for the soul of Dr. Chen's company. The actual flight test began 20 minutes later. Unit 4 lifted off with the smooth precision that characterized well-engineered aircraft, its rotors generating the distinctive whir of advanced drone technology. Mac found himself holding his breath as the aircraft executed maneuvers designed to showcase its stability and payload capacity. Beautiful flight characteristics, Dr. Voss reported through the intercom system. All systems nominal, structural integrity excellent throughout the test sequence. Mac felt a complex mixture of pride and terror as his secret modifications performed flawlessly under public scrutiny. The aircraft that might have suffered catastrophic failure was instead demonstrating capabilities that exceeded original specifications. But his satisfaction was interrupted by an announcement that made his blood run cold. "Dr. Chen," came Dr. Voss's voice over the intercom. "We need to discuss some unusual findings in the pre-flight inspection. There are structural modifications that weren't in our fabrication records." The conference room fell silent, except for the distant sound of Unit 4's rotors as it completed its demonstration flight. Mac watched Dr. Chen's expression shift from confident presenter to concerned engineer as the implications registered. "The modifications are actually improvements," Dr. Voss continued. "Whoever made them understood our design better than we did. But they were performed without authorization, possibly during off-hours access to the lab facilities." Mac felt the walls closing in as Dr. Chen's eyes swept the conference room, perhaps wondering if their mystery modifier was among the gathered crowd. The investigation that would examine security logs and badge access records had just begun in front of 200 witnesses. "We'll address those concerns after the demonstration," Dr. Chen replied smoothly, but Mac could hear the underlying tension in her voice. Unit 4 completed its flight test with textbook precision, landing on the rooftop pad to enthusiastic applause from investors who had witnessed exactly the kind of performance that justified their confidence. But Mac knew the real reckoning was just beginning. As the formal presentation concluded and attendees moved toward the reception area, Mac made his way to the building's lower levels. His shift didn't officially begin for another 4 hours, but he needed to collect his personal items before the inevitable investigation reached his locker. The service areas felt different, now less like refuge and more like a trap waiting to spring. Mac's security badge, which had provided access to restricted areas during his unauthorized modifications, now felt like evidence of criminal activity rather than legitimate employment. His phone buzzed with another text from Mrs. Rodriguez. "Rosie asking when Daddy coming home. Breathing better but still worried about her." Mac stared at the message, weighing his daughter's immediate needs against the approaching storm of corporate investigation. Rosie's rescue inhaler was nearly empty, and refilling it required the insurance coverage that depended on his continued employment. But his employment was about to end with revelations that could lead to criminal charges. Standing in the building's basement service area, surrounded by the tools and supplies that had provided him with honest work for exactly 2 weeks, Mac faced the consequences of choices made in desperation. His modifications had saved Unit 4 from catastrophic failure, but they had also created an electronic trail that would soon expose him as the mysterious Midnight Engineer. The evening news would report Chen Technologies' successful demonstration as a triumph of humanitarian innovation. Investors would commit funding based on performance they had witnessed firsthand. Dr. Chen's vision for disaster relief technology would receive the validation she needed to resist board pressure toward military applications. But none of those victories would protect Mac from the investigation that Dr. Voss had already begun. Somewhere in the building's security systems, badge scanner logs were waiting to reveal that janitor number 2847 had been accessing restricted areas during unauthorized hours. Mac pulled his daughter's rescue inhaler from his pocket, nearly empty now, representing medication they couldn't afford to replace without insurance coverage. In a few hours, his secret would be exposed and his employment terminated. Rosie would lose her health coverage just as her condition was worsening. The successful demonstration upstairs represented everything Mac had hoped to protect. Dr. Chen's humanitarian mission, the lives that would be saved by reliable aircraft, and the integrity of engineering work that mattered. But success couldn't shield him from the consequences of the methods he had used to achieve it. Walking through the service corridors where he had spent the happiest work hours he had known in months, Mac carried the weight of approaching judgment. His Rosie's inhaler, nearly empty but still providing the medication that kept her breathing, represented both his motivation and what he stood to lose when the investigation revealed his identity. The artifact that symbolized his daughter's fragility and his own desperation would soon be joined by the security badge that had made him both savior and saboteur in equal measure. Dr. Aurelia Chen stood in her corner office 43 floors above the city, staring at printouts that would change everything she thought she knew about her company's mysterious midnight engineer. The security badge access logs, spread across her mahogany desk, told a story that seemed impossible. Badge 2847, assigned to maintenance worker Ethan McAllister, had accessed restricted lab areas during 17 unauthorized visits over the past 2 weeks. The name meant nothing to her initially. Chen Technologies employed over 800 people across multiple divisions, but when her assistant had pulled the employment file, Dr. Chen found herself staring at a photograph that sparked immediate recognition, the desperate man who had pleaded for work outside the service entrance. "This can't be right," she murmured, studying Mac's hiring paperwork. According to his application, he had listed his previous experience as general maintenance and janitorial services. No mention of engineering background, no technical certifications, no indication that he possessed the expertise necessary to improve aircraft designs that had challenged her best engineers. Dr. Chen reached for her secure phone and dialed an extension she rarely used. "Security, this is Dr. Chen. I need you to quietly locate maintenance worker Ethan McAllister. Don't apprehend him, just tell me where he is." While waiting for the response, Dr. Chen opened her laptop and began searching for information about the man she had hired on impulse. A deeper background check revealed layers of deception that made her question everything about their encounter. The search results painted a picture that contradicted everything Mac had told her. Ethan Mac McAllister wasn't a career janitor looking for steady work. He was a master welder with 20 years of experience in advanced structural engineering. His specialty had been bridge construction, specifically the development of innovative welding techniques for composite and steel joint systems. "Jesus," Dr. Chen whispered as she read through Mac's professional history. His work at Meridian Steel had included revolutionary protocols for stress distribution in dissimilar material joints, exactly the kind of expertise required to solve the fracture problems that had been discovered in Unit 4. But the most shocking revelation came when Dr. Chen found Mac's portfolio of bridge designs archived in professional engineering databases. The Cascade River Bridge, completed 3 years earlier, featured joint systems that were nearly identical to the modifications found in Unit 4. Mac hadn't just randomly improved, her aircraft had applied techniques that represented the cutting edge of structural engineering. Dr. Chen's secure phone buzzed. "Dr. Chen? Security here. McAllister is in Building C, Sub-Level 2. He appears to be cleaning his equipment locker." "Don't approach him yet," Dr. Chen instructed. "I'm coming down." The elevator ride to the service levels gave Dr. Chen time to process the implications of what she had discovered. The man she had hired as an act of charity was actually overqualified for most positions in her company. His desperate plea for any job had been literal truth. He was willing to work as a janitor, despite possessing expertise that could command 6-figure salaries. But why? What circumstances had reduced a master engineer to begging for maintenance work? Dr. Chen found the answer in medical billing records that Mac's background check had revealed. His wife Sarah had died of cancer 18 months earlier, after a battle that had consumed their savings and left them deeply in debt. Rosie's ongoing asthma treatment required expensive medications and specialist care. When Meridian Steel closed due to overseas competition, Mac had been unable to find engineering work in a contracting market. The financial pressure had forced him to accept any employment that provided health insurance for his daughter. His expertise in structural engineering was irrelevant if no one would hire him for positions that matched his qualifications. Dr. Chen descended to sub-level 2 with a mixture of anger and admiration that she couldn't quite reconcile. Mac had lied about his background, violated security protocols, and performed unauthorized modifications to multi-million-dollar equipment. But he had also solved engineering problems that her trained staff had missed, potentially saving lives and certainly improving her aircraft beyond original specifications. She found Mac methodically packing personal items from a maintenance locker, his movements careful and deliberate. He looked up as she approached, his expression shifting from surprise to resignation as he recognized her. "Dr. Chen," Mac said quietly, "I was going to turn in my badge and keys before my shift started. Were you planning to tell me about your real background?" Dr. Chen asked, holding up the printouts that documented his professional history. "Or were you going to let me continue believing you were just a janitor who happened to be handy with aircraft modifications?" Mac's shoulders sagged with the weight of inevitable confession. "I needed the job, Mum, for my daughter. She has asthma, and the medical bills." He caught himself, straightening with the dignity she remembered from their first encounter. "I should have been honest about my qualifications." "Your qualifications?" Dr. Chen's voice carried a mixture of disbelief and growing anger. "Mac, you designed the stress distribution system for the Cascade River Bridge. Your welding innovations are used in infrastructure projects across 3 states. You're not overqualified for janitorial work, you're overqualified for most engineering positions in my company." Mac met her gaze directly, the same quiet dignity that had prompted her to hire him still evident, despite the circumstances. "None of that matters if no one will hire you for those positions. I applied for engineering jobs for 8 months, 237 applications, 18 interviews, 0 offers." The simple statement carried more weight than elaborate explanations. Dr. Chen understood the brutal mathematics of unemployment in a contracting industry, the way expertise became irrelevant when too many qualified candidates competed for too few positions. "So you took a janitorial job and secretly fixed problems that my engineering team couldn't solve," Dr. Chen said. "I saw the fractures in the composite joints," Mac replied. "Unit 4 and the others, they had stress concentration points that would have led to catastrophic failure under operational loads. I couldn't just ignore it." Dr. Chen studied the man who had become both an asset and a liability to her company. "You violated security protocols, performed unauthorized modifications to prototype aircraft, lied on your employment application." "Yes, ma'am. And in the process, you solved engineering problems that saved my company from potential disaster and improved our aircraft beyond original specifications." Mac nodded silently, understanding that his professional contributions couldn't erase the violations of trust and protocol that had made them possible. Dr. Chen made a decision that surprised even herself. "I'm not firing you, Mac, but I'm not keeping you as a janitor either." Mac's expression shifted from resignation to confusion. "Ma'am?" "Monday morning, you report to Dr. Voss in engineering development. We're creating a new position, Senior Innovation Consultant. Your job will be to identify problems that our standard review processes miss and develop solutions that exceed conventional approaches." "Dr. Chen, I can't. The salary is $95,000 annually, plus full medical benefits that will cover your daughter's treatment." Chen continued, overriding his protests. "Your title will be Senior Innovation Consultant, but your real job is to be the expert we didn't know we needed." Mac stared at her with an expression that cycled through disbelief, gratitude, and lingering confusion. "Why?" "Because results matter more than methods," Dr. Chen replied. Because my aircraft are better because of your work. Because I'd rather have you solving problems from inside my company than watching you fix things from the shadows." She paused, studying Mac's face as her offer registered. "Also because I remember what it feels like to be told your expertise doesn't matter. I started this company because Boeing wouldn't listen to my ideas about humanitarian applications for aerospace technology. Sometimes the best innovations come from people who are desperate enough to ignore conventional boundaries." Mac's original bridge design portfolio, which Dr. Chen now carried in a manila folder, represented the revelation that had changed everything. The artifact that exposed his true expertise also revealed the irony of his situation, a master engineer reduced to begging for janitorial work not because he lacked skills, but because a contracting industry had no place for his talents. "Your daughter needs stability," Dr. Chen continued. "Your family needs security. My company needs your expertise. This arrangement serves everyone's interests." Mac's voice was barely above a whisper. "Rosie's inhaler is almost empty. The insurance coverage will begin immediately," Dr. Chen assured him. "Your daughter's medical care is now a company priority." Standing in the basement service area where Mac had spent 2 weeks hiding his true capabilities, Dr. Chen extended her hand in a gesture that acknowledged both his expertise and his humanity. "Welcome to Chen Technologies' engineering team, Mac. Your real job starts Monday." Mac shook her hand with the firm grip of someone accepting not just employment, but the restoration of professional identity. The desperate stranger who had pleaded for any work had become the expert consultant who would help guide humanitarian technology toward its full potential. The bridge designs that had once been hidden in storage were about to become the foundation for innovations that could save lives around the world. The weekend that followed, Dr. Chen's revelation passed in a blur of medical appointments and emotional recalibration that left Mac feeling as though he had stepped into someone else's life. Saturday morning brought Rosie's long-delayed visit to the pediatric pulmonologist, Dr. Amanda Foster, whose expertise had been financially out of reach for months. "Her condition is definitely manageable with the right treatment protocol," Dr. Foster explained, reviewing chest x-rays that showed improvement even from the previous week. "The chronic inflammation has been undertreated, but we can address that with a combination therapy that should give her much better control." Mac listened to medical terminology that had once terrified him with costs they couldn't afford. Now, with comprehensive insurance coverage that would begin Monday, those same treatments represented hope rather than financial catastrophe. "Daddy, does this mean I can play soccer again?" Rosie asked, her 7-year-old optimism undaunted by months of breathing difficulties. "We'll see what Dr. Foster says," Mac replied, but privately he felt the first stirrings of genuine hope he had experienced since Sarah's death. Sunday afternoon found Mac in his storage unit, carefully packing the engineering references and tools he would need for his new position. The bridge design portfolio that had exposed his true expertise now seemed like artifacts from a previous life evidence of capabilities he had almost forgotten he possessed. His phone rang as he loaded textbooks on composite stress analysis into a cardboard box. Dr. Chen's number appeared on the screen, unexpected on a weekend. "Mac, I'm sorry to call you at home, but we have a situation that requires your immediate attention." The urgency in her voice triggered the anxiety that had become Mac's default emotional state over the past months. "What's wrong?" "The board called an emergency session for tomorrow morning. Robert Winters has convinced 3 other members that the mysterious aircraft modifications represent a security breach that requires immediate investigation. They're demanding that I identify and terminate whoever made unauthorized changes to our prototypes." Mac felt his newly stable world beginning to shift again. "Dr. Chen, I understand if you need to." "I'm not throwing you under the bus, Mac," Dr. Chen interrupted, "but I need you to be prepared for a fight. Winters wants to use this situation to force a pivot toward military contracts. He's arguing that security breaches prove our humanitarian focus makes us vulnerable to industrial espionage. The political implications were beyond Mac's experience, but he understood the basic dynamic. His unauthorized modifications had become ammunition in a corporate power struggle that could determine Chen Technologies' future direction. "What do you need me to do?" Mac asked. "Be ready to defend your work publicly," Dr. Chen replied. "Tomorrow's board meeting will include major investors and media representatives. If we're going to fight Winter's narrative, we need to show that your modifications represent innovation, not security vulnerability." Monday morning arrived with the kind of Seattle rain that seemed to match the gravity of the day ahead. Mac arrived at Chen Technologies 2 hours early, wearing his best interview suit and carrying a leather portfolio that contained documentation of his bridge engineering work. The building felt different as he entered through the main lobby, rather than the service entrance where his employment had begun. Executive assistants who had never noticed him during his janitorial shifts now acknowledged him with the polite recognition accorded to senior staff. Dr. Voss met him in the engineering department conference room, where she had assembled a comprehensive presentation about the aircraft modifications. Her manner was professional but warm, suggesting that she harbored no resentment about Mac's deceptive employment circumstances. "Your welding technique is genuinely innovative," Dr. Voss began, displaying microscopic images of Mac's joint reinforcements. "The stress distribution is more efficient than anything in our standard protocols. We've been studying your methods all weekend." Mac reviewed the technical analysis with growing confidence. His midnight modifications had not only prevented catastrophic failure, but had actually improved the aircraft's performance beyond original design specifications. "The board will want to understand how an unauthorized janitor possessed the expertise to outperform our engineering team," Dr. Voss continued. "Are you prepared to explain your background?" "Yes, ma'am," Mac replied, though privately he wondered if his explanation would sound credible to people who moved in worlds where desperation rarely forced overqualification into menial employment. The boardroom on the 42nd floor commanded a panoramic view of Seattle's skyline, its mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs that probably cost more than Mac's monthly rent. Board members, investors, and media representatives filled the space with the kind of subdued energy that preceded significant corporate decisions. Mac took his assigned seat near Dr. Chen, acutely aware that his presence represented either vindication of her hiring practices or evidence of her poor judgment. The live demonstration script that Dr. Chen had prepared for the meeting represented their shared attempt to frame his story as innovation rather than insubordination. Robert Winters called the meeting to order with the gravitas of someone accustomed to wielding authority over others' professional destinies. His opening remarks painted Mac's modifications as a security breach that demonstrated the dangers of Chen Technologies' current operational approach. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here to address a serious breach of corporate security," Winters began, his voice carrying the measured authority that had built his reputation in aerospace management. Unauthorized modifications were made to prototype aircraft by someone with access to restricted facilities. This represents exactly the kind of vulnerability that makes our current humanitarian focus a liability rather than an asset. Dr. Chen responded with her own prepared remarks, positioning Mac's work as evidence of the innovative culture that made Chen Technologies valuable to investors seeking breakthrough technology rather than conventional military applications. "Mr. Winter's security concerns are understandable," Dr. Chen acknowledged, "but they miss the larger significance of what happened. Our company culture attracted and empowered an expert whose contributions improved our aircraft beyond original specifications. That's not a security breach. That's exactly the kind of innovation that creates competitive advantage." The formal presentations concluded, leaving Mac to face direct questioning from board members who would determine both his future and the direction of Dr. Chen's company. The live broadcast equipment that surrounded the boardroom table meant that his explanation would be recorded for posterity, becoming either the foundation of his professional rehabilitation or evidence of his corporate deception. Winters leaned forward in his chair, studying Mac with the calculating expression of someone preparing to expose weakness. "Mr. McAllister, you falsified your employment application, violated security protocols, and performed unauthorized modifications to multi-million-dollar equipment. How do you justify actions that would constitute criminal behavior in most corporate environments?" Mac had spent the weekend preparing for exactly this question, but facing it in the corporate boardroom felt like standing before a tribunal that would judge not just his actions, but his worth as a human being. "Mr. Winters, everything you've said is factually accurate," Mac replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I lied on my application because 8 months of honest applications hadn't resulted in employment that could provide health insurance for my daughter. I violated security protocols because I saw structural flaws that could have caused catastrophic failure and loss of life. I performed unauthorized modifications because my professional conscience wouldn't allow me to stay silent when I knew how to prevent disaster." The boardroom fell silent except for the quiet hum of recording equipment and the distant sound of rain against the windows. Mac continued, drawing on reserves of dignity that had sustained him through months of rejection and desperation. "I'm not proud of the deception, but I'm not ashamed of the work. Unit 4 is safer because of my modifications. The people who will depend on these aircraft for medical supplies in disaster zones are safer because someone was willing to break protocol to prevent failures that could have cost lives." Mac reached for the leather portfolio beside his chair, extracting documentation that represented 20 years of professional achievement. "These are my bridge designs, Mr. Winters. Infrastructure that carries thousands of people every day, built using techniques I developed to make joint systems stronger and more resilient, the same techniques I applied to Dr. Chen's aircraft." He slid the portfolio across the mahogany table, watching Winters examine designs that proved Mac's expertise was legitimate rather than fraudulent. "I didn't take this job to sabotage Chen Technologies," Mac concluded. "I took it because my daughter needs medical insurance, and I was willing to do anything, even empty trash binsto provide it. The modifications happened because I couldn't watch aircraft go into production with flaws that would kill people." The weight of judgment pressed down on the boardroom as Mac finished his explanation. His professional vindication depended not just on the technical merit of his work, but on the board's willingness to value desperate expertise over conventional employment protocols. The live demonstration script that would determine Chen Technologies' future and Mac's place within it waited for a response that could transform a janitor's midnight repairs into the foundation of a corporate revolution. The silence that followed Mac's explanation stretched across the boardroom like a held breath. Robert Winters studied the bridge design portfolio with the careful attention of someone looking for ammunition rather than understanding. Around the mahogany table, board members exchanged glances that suggested private conversations and predetermined positions. Dr. Chen watched the dynamics with growing tension, recognizing that Mac's future and her own authority within the company hung in the balance of political calculations that had little to do with engineering merit. "Mr. McAllister's personal circumstances are sympathetic," Winters said finally, closing the portfolio with deliberate emphasis. "But corporate security cannot be compromised by individual hardship, however compelling. We have protocols for a reason." Board member Margaret Hewitt, whose investment firm held substantial Chen Technologies equity, leaned forward with the expression of someone about to deliver an uncomfortable truth. "Robert raises valid concerns about precedent. If we excuse unauthorized modification 7 beneficial ones, we create a culture where employees feel entitled to violate security protocols whenever they believe their expertise justifies it." Mac felt the weight of corporate judgment bearing down on him, but before he could respond, Dr. Chen stood and moved toward the presentation screen that dominated one wall of the boardroom. "With respect, Margaret, I think we're approaching this from the wrong perspective," Dr. Chen said, activating the display system. The question isn't whether Mac violated protocol, clearly did. The question is whether Chen Technologies is the kind of company that punishes innovation or embraces it. The screen filled with technical diagrams that showed Unit 4's performance improvements, side-by-side comparisons that demonstrated how Mac's modifications had exceeded original design specifications. These modifications didn't just prevent structural failure, Dr. Chen continued. They improved our aircraft's performance by 18%. 18% better stress distribution, 18% more reliable under extreme conditions, 18% more likely to complete humanitarian missions successfully. She clicked to the next slide, showing market projections that painted Mac's innovations in terms that board members could understand. Competitive advantage measured in dollars and market share. Military contractors will reverse engineer our improvements within 6 months of deployment, Dr. Chen explained. But humanitarian applications give us first mover advantage in markets that our competitors haven't prioritized. Mac's innovations make us leaders in technology that saves lives rather than followers in technology that takes them. Mac watched the presentation with growing amazement as Dr. Chen transformed his desperate midnight repairs into strategic corporate assets. She was fighting for his future, but more importantly, she was fighting for the vision that had driven her to build Chen Technologies in the first place. The live broadcast equipment surrounding the boardroom captured every word of the debate, recording a corporate drama that would either validate humanitarian technology or force its abandonment in favor of more traditional military applications. Winters shifted uncomfortably as Dr. Chen's presentation continued, clearly recognizing that her arguments were gaining traction with board members who valued innovation over conventional protocol. Aurelia makes compelling points about market advantage, admitted board member David Kim, whose background in aerospace engineering gave his opinion particular weight. But we still haven't addressed the fundamental security concerns. How do we prevent future unauthorized modifications while encouraging the kind of innovation Mac demonstrated? It was the opening Dr. Chen had been hoping for, an acknowledgement that Mac's work had value, combined with a practical question about implementation rather than condemnation. We create an innovation consulting position that gives Mac official authorization for the work he was doing unofficially, Dr. Chen replied. Senior Innovation Consultant, reporting directly to me, with explicit responsibility for identifying and addressing design flaws that standard review processes might miss. Mac realized he was watching Dr. Chen make the job offer public, transforming it from private arrangement to corporate policy that would be difficult for the board to reverse. Mac's expertise is too valuable to waste and too dangerous to ignore, Dr. Chen continued. Better to have him working within our system than watching from the outside. Winters made one final attempt to frame the situation in terms that supported his preferred outcome. This sets a dangerous precedent. What happens when other employees decide their personal expertise justifies violating security protocols? But before anyone could respond, the boardroom's main display system activated with an incoming video call that changed the entire dynamic of the meeting. Dr. Chen, this is Colonel Martinez with the UN Humanitarian Response Coordination Office, came the voice from the speakers. We're calling because we understand Chen Technologies is developing medical supply drones for disaster relief. Dr. Chen moved quickly to activate the room's camera system, her expression shifting from boardroom politics to international humanitarian crisis. Colonel Martinez, you're addressing our board of directors. How can we help? We have a situation developing in the Philippines. Typhoon Socorro has cut off 3 islands from traditional supply routes. Approximately 8,000 people need immediate medical assistance, but weather conditions make helicopter delivery impossible. The colonel's words carried the urgency of lives hanging in the balance, transforming the boardroom debate from abstract corporate policy to immediate humanitarian need. Our meteorologists estimate a narrow window for drone operations, perhaps 6 hours, when wind conditions might allow unmanned aircraft to reach the affected areas. We need aircraft capable of carrying medical supplies through severe weather conditions. Mac felt his heart rate spike as he realized the colonel was describing exactly the kind of mission that would test his modifications under the most demanding real-world conditions imaginable. "Colonel, our prototypes could potentially handle those conditions," Dr. Chen replied carefully. "But this would be our first deployment under extreme weather circumstances." "Dr. Chen, people are dying. Traditional aircraft can't reach them. If your drones have any chance of completing this mission, we need to discuss deployment immediately." The boardroom fell silent as the implications registered. Mac's unauthorized modifications, which had been the subject of political debate moments earlier, might now represent the difference between life and death for thousands of people trapped by natural disaster. Winters looked uncomfortable as he realized the conversation had shifted beyond corporate protocol to humanitarian crisis that would be difficult to oppose without appearing callous. "Colonel Martinez," Dr. Chen said, "we'll need 30 minutes to consult with our engineering team and confirm our aircraft's capabilities for this mission profile." "Understood. But Dr. Chen, if you can help these people, please don't let bureaucracy delay the decision. We're running out of time." The video call ended, leaving the boardroom to grapple with a reality that none of them had anticipated when the meeting began. Mac's modifications were no longer hypothetical improvements to be debated. They were potentially life-saving technology facing immediate deployment under the most challenging conditions imaginable. The live broadcast equipment that had been recording corporate politics was now documenting a humanitarian crisis that would test everything Chen Technologies claimed to represent. The 30-minute deadline that Colonel Martinez had imposed transformed the boardroom from a venue for corporate politics into a crisis command center. Dr. Chen established video connections with the engineering team, while Mac found himself thrust into the role of technical consultant for a mission that could validate or destroy everything he had worked to achieve. "The typhoon conditions are beyond our original design parameters," Dr. Voss reported from the engineering lab, her voice carrying the tension of someone tasked with impossible calculations. "Wind speeds of up to 80 knots, severe turbulence, and visibility near zero. Standard protocols would ground all aircraft operations." Mac studied the meteorological data streaming across the boardroom displays, his engineer's mind automatically processing wind patterns and stress loads that would challenge any aircraft, much less experimental drones. But his modifications had been specifically designed to address exactly these kinds of extreme conditions. "Dr. Voss, the reinforcements I installed were calculated for wind loads exceeding design specifications," Mac said, his voice carrying more confidence than he felt. "The joint systems should be able to handle the stress patterns we're seeing in the weather data." Robert Winters shifted uncomfortably as Mac's expertise became central to the humanitarian mission that the board could hardly oppose without appearing heartless. "Can we guarantee mission success?" Winters asked, attempting to regain control of the narrative. "The liability exposure alone." "There are no guarantees in disaster relief," Dr. Chen interrupted. "But Mac's modifications give us the best chance of reaching people who will die without medical assistance." The engineering team's analysis continued in real time, with technical data streaming across multiple displays as they evaluated Unit 4's capabilities against typhoon conditions. Mac found himself explaining stress calculations and joint specifications to board members who were struggling to understand technology that could mean life or death for thousands of people. The original design would have failed catastrophically under these conditions, Mac explained, pointing to computer models that showed stress concentration points exceeding material tolerances. "My reinforcements redistribute those loads through multiple pathways, essentially making the aircraft anti-fragile rather than just strong." Margaret Hewitt leaned forward with the expression of someone beginning to understand the magnitude of what they were discussing. "You're saying Mac's unauthorized modifications are the only thing that makes this mission possible?" That's exactly what I'm saying, Mac replied. Dr. Chen activated her connection to Colonel Martinez, the urgency of the humanitarian crisis overriding corporate protocol. Colonel, we believe our aircraft can complete the mission, but we need real-time weather updates and precise coordinates for the medical supply drops. Dr. Chen, the situation is deteriorating rapidly, the colonel replied, his voice carrying the weight of command decisions made under extreme pressure. We have pregnant women in labor without medical assistance, children with severe dehydration, and elderly people whose medication was lost in the typhoon. Every hour of delay increases the casualty count. The boardroom fell silent as the human cost of their deliberations became unavoidably clear. This was no longer about corporate policy or employment disputes. It was about whether Chen Technologies would risk its most advanced prototype to save lives that no other aircraft could reach. Mac made a decision that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. "I'll pilot the mission personally," he announced, his voice cutting through the technical discussions and political considerations. Dr. Chen stared at him with an expression of shock. "Mac, you're not a certified drone pilot." "No, but I understand the aircraft's modifications better than anyone else. If the structural integrity becomes questionable during flight, I'll know how to compensate in ways that standard pilots wouldn't recognize." Mac's father's welding torch, which had been sitting in his storage unit since his unemployment began, suddenly seemed relevant to the discussion. The artifact that represented generational expertise and the courage to claim his rightful place would soon become the symbol of his transformation from invisible janitor to recognized expert. "The control systems are intuitive enough for someone with engineering background," Mac continued, "and if these aircraft are going to fail, I'd rather they fail with someone who understands why." Robert Winters made one final attempt to prevent what he clearly saw as reckless precedent-setting. "This is exactly the kind of cowboy mentality that creates liability exposure. We need certified professionals, not janitors playing engineer." But board member David Kim cut him off with the quiet authority of someone who had made life-and-death decisions in aerospace environments. "Robert, people are dying while we debate credentials. If Mac's modifications make this mission possible, and if he's willing to risk his own safety to prove their reliability, then we should support the mission rather than obstruct it." Dr. Chen looked around the boardroom, reading expressions that suggested the tide had turned against Winter's obstructionist approach. "All in favor of authorizing the humanitarian mission with Mac as pilot consultant?" 6 hands rose around the table. Only Winters abstained, his expression suggesting reluctant acceptance of a decision he couldn't prevent without appearing callous. "Colonel Martinez, Chen Technologies is authorizing deployment of Unit 4 for your humanitarian mission," Dr. Chen announced. "We'll have the aircraft prepared for transport to your staging area within 2 hours." "Dr. Chen, if this works, if your aircraft can reach those people, you'll have saved thousands of lives." The weight of that responsibility settled over the boardroom as the video call ended. Mac found himself at the center of a mission that would either vindicate his expertise or expose him as a fraud who had endangered lives through unauthorized modifications. "Mac," Dr. Chen said quietly, "are you absolutely certain about the structural integrity?" Mac pulled his father's welding torch from the briefcase he had brought to the Matinga tool that had been passed down through 3 generations of craftsmen who had built things designed to last. The torch represented not just technical capability, but the moral obligation to stand behind work that mattered. "Dr. Chen, I stake my reputation and my life on those modifications," Mac replied. "If they fail, it won't be because the engineering was wrong. It will be because the conditions exceeded anything that any aircraft could handle." Within hours, Mac would be piloting a prototype aircraft through typhoon conditions toward islands where thousands of people waited for medical supplies that could mean the difference between life and death. His unauthorized midnight repairs would face the ultimate test under conditions that would either prove his expertise or expose him as a janitor who had overestimated his abilities. The torch that his father had used to build bridges and his grandfather had used to construct ships would soon become the symbol of Mac's transformation from desperate job seeker to the expert who stood behind his work when lives depended on its reliability. 6 months later, Mac McAllister stood on the observation deck of Chen Technologies' new Humanitarian Operations Center, watching Unit 4 undergo final preparations for its 15th disaster relief mission. The aircraft that had once carried his secret modifications now bore official designations and certifications, its innovative joint systems having become the industry standard for extreme weather drone operations. The morning Seattle sun painted the harbor in shades of gold and amber, but Mac's attention was focused on the bustle of activity below. Emergency medical supplies destined for earthquake victims in Central America filled the cargo bay, while technicians conducted pre-flight checks with procedures that Mac had helped develop. "Daddy, will you be flying today?" Rosie asked, tugging on the sleeve of his dress shirt. At 8 years old, she had grown accustomed to visiting her father's workplace, her breathing now clear and strong, thanks to the comprehensive treatment plan that his insurance coverage had made possible. "Not today, sweetheart," Mac replied, lifting her onto his shoulders so she could see over the safety railing. "Dr. Martinez is our pilot for this mission. I just make sure the aircraft are strong enough to do their job." Rosie nodded with the satisfied understanding of a child whose world had become stable and predictable. Her asthma was well controlled now, her medical care managed by specialists who no longer represented financial catastrophe. The rescue inhaler that had once symbolized their desperation now served as routine medication in a life defined by security rather than crisis. Dr. Chen joined them on the observation deck, carrying the new company badge that identified Mac as Chief Innovation Engineer, a title that reflected both his technical expertise and his unique perspective on problems that conventional approaches might miss. "The UN called this morning, Dr. Chen reported. "They want to discuss expanding our disaster relief fleet. Apparently, our aircraft are the only ones capable of operating in conditions that ground traditional helicopters." Max smiled at the irony. The modifications he had performed in desperation, violating protocols and risking his employment, had become the foundation for a humanitarian technology revolution that was saving lives around the world. "Any word from the Philippines mission?" Mac asked. "All 8,000 people evacuated successfully," Dr. Chen replied. "Zero aircraft losses, zero mission failures. The joint reinforcement system you developed has become the benchmark for extreme weather operations." The Typhoon mission that had tested Mac's modifications under the most demanding conditions imaginable had succeeded beyond anyone's projections. Unit 4 had completed 17 supply runs through weather that would have destroyed conventional aircraft, delivering medical assistance to islands that had been cut off from all other forms of aid. The success had transformed Chen Technologies from a struggling startup facing board pressure to pivot toward military applications into the industry leader in humanitarian drone technology. Orders for Mac's reinforcement systems came from disaster relief organizations around the world, generating revenue that made military contracts unnecessary. "Dr. Chen, there's something I need to tell you," Mac said, his voice carrying the weight of a confession he had been preparing for months. Dr. Chen studied his expression with concern. "What is it, Mac?" "I've been working on new modifications," Mac admitted. "Not unauthorized this time, everything documented and approved through proper channels. But I think I've found a way to extend our aircraft's range by 30% without compromising structural integrity." Dr. Chen's worried expression shifted to amusement as she realized Mac was announcing innovation rather than problems. "You're telling me you've solved our range limitations?" "I think so. The technique involves variable geometry wing connections that adapt to flight conditions. It's based on principles I developed for bridge joints that need to flex with wind loads." Mac pulled out a tablet displaying technical diagrams that showed wing systems capable of morphing configuration during flight, adapting to conditions in ways that maximized efficiency while maintaining structural strength. This could revolutionize disaster relief operations, Dr. Chen said, studying the designs with growing excitement. Aircraft that can reach remote areas we currently can't serve. That's the idea, Mac agreed. I've learned to work within the system instead of around it. The observation deck's intercom crackled with an announcement from the Flight Operations Center. Unit 4 cleared for takeoff. Medical supplies en route to Guatemala disaster zone. Mac and Rosie watched the aircraft lift off with the smooth precision that had become routine for Chen Technologies' humanitarian fleet. The prototype that had once carried secret modifications now represented proven technology that had saved thousands of lives and established new standards for disaster relief operations. "Daddy, are you happy with your job now?" Rosie asked, her question carrying the simple directness that children brought to complex situations. Mac considered the question as he watched Unit 4 disappear into the morning sky, carrying medical supplies to people who needed help that only his innovations could provide. 6 months earlier, he had stood outside this same building, pleading for any work that could provide insurance coverage for his daughter. Now he held a position that utilized his expertise while serving humanitarian purposes that gave meaning to technical achievement. "Yes, sweetheart," Mac replied. "I think I've finally found the job I was meant to do." Dr. Chen smiled at the exchange, remembering the desperate stranger who had approached her outside the service entrance with a simple plea. "Please give me any job, Mom. I'll do anything." The corporate revolution that had followed Mac's hiring had transformed Chen Technologies from a company threatened by board politics into an organization that valued innovation over credentials, expertise over employment history, and humanitarian purpose over quarterly profits. "Mac, there's one more thing," Dr. Chen said, pulling an envelope from her jacket pocket. The board voted unanimously to establish the McAllister Innovation Fund. It provides college scholarships for children of unemployed technical workers and research grants for engineers developing humanitarian applications for existing technology. Mac stared at the envelope containing documentation of an endowment that would help other families avoid the desperation he had experienced. The fund represented recognition that valuable expertise often resided in unexpected places, and that corporate success could serve purposes beyond shareholder profits. The first scholarship recipient is starting at MIT this fall. Dr. Chen continued, a young woman whose father lost his job in the aerospace downsizing. Her mother works 3 part-time jobs to pay for her daughter's education. Mac thought of all the talented people whose skills went unrecognized because economic pressures forced them into employment that didn't match their capabilities. The scholarship fund would provide opportunities for families facing the same desperation that had driven him to plead for janitorial work. As the morning progressed into afternoon, Mac returned to his engineering laboratory, where bridge design principles were being adapted for aircraft applications that could change the future of disaster relief. The tools and reference materials that had once been stored in a unit he could barely afford now occupied a state-of-the-art facility dedicated to humanitarian innovation. His new company badge identifying him as Chief Innovation Engineer rather than maintenance worker represented more than professional advancement. It symbolized the recognition that expertise and worth weren't always reflected in conventional credentials, and that sometimes the most valuable contributions came from people who had been overlooked by traditional hiring processes. The evening news that night would report Chen Technologies' successful mission to Guatemala, highlighting aircraft capable of operating in conditions that grounded all other relief efforts. The story would mention the innovative joint systems developed by the company's engineering team, but it wouldn't identify the former janitor whose midnight modifications had made such missions possible. Mac preferred it that way. His satisfaction came not from public recognition but from the knowledge that his work was saving lives, that his daughter's future was secure, and that his expertise was finally being used for purposes that mattered. Walking home through the Seattle evening with Rosie's hand in his, Mac carried the quiet contentment of someone who had found not just employment, but purpose. The corporate tower that had once seemed impossibly remote now represented a workplace where innovation was valued and humanitarian goals took precedence over military applications. The bridge designs that had exposed his true expertise remained in his office, not as artifacts from a previous life, but as the foundation for ongoing work that connected engineering excellence with human need. Sometimes, Mac reflected, the strongest bridges weren't built with steel and concrete, but with the recognition that every person possessed worth that transcended their employment circumstances. In his pocket, Rosie's current inhaler served as a reminder of how far they had traveled from the desperation that had driven him to beg for work outside a service entrance. The medication that had once represented financial catastrophe now symbolized the security that allowed him to focus on innovation rather than survival. Mac McAllister had found more than a job at Chen Technologies. He had discovered that sometimes when you're willing to do anything for the people you love, you find exactly the place where your skills can change the world. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love us the most are the ones who hurt us deepest. Sometimes our greatest shame becomes the doorway to our greatest blessing. In the frontier town of Cold Mercy, Preacher Mercer hands his pregnant daughter over to a giant rancher named Cade Rawlins. Everyone thinks it's punishment. Everyone thinks she'll suffer. But Cade does something nobody expects. He treats her with kindness. He gives her safety. He sees her worth when nobody else will. What happens when the man everyone fears becomes the only person who truly loves her? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Cold Mercy's dusty main street, but there was nothing warm about the light that filtered through the grimy windows of the general store. Mrs. Abernathy pressed her thin lips together as she watched Lila Jane Mercer walk past, her condition now impossible to hide beneath the loose-fitting dress that had once belonged to her mother. "Shameful," she whispered to her husband, loud enough for half the store to hear. "That poor preacher, having to bear such disgrace from his own flesh and blood." Lila kept her chin up as she passed, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. At 19, she had learned to navigate the cruel currents of small-town judgment, but these past months had tested even her strongest reserves. The weight in her belly had grown heavier with each passing week, and with it, the weight of her father's disappointment. Cold Mercy, Montana Territory, had earned its name honestly. Carved from unforgiving wilderness in 1867, the town clung to survival through sheer stubbornness and the kind of moral rigidity that could freeze a man's soul even in summer. The main street stretched barely 4 blocks, lined with weathered storefronts that had seen better days before most folks could remember. At one end stood the Methodist church, its white steeple rising like an accusing finger toward heaven. At the other, the saloon squatted like a toad, drawing the kind of men the good ladies of Cold Mercy pretended not to notice. Between these two poles of salvation and sin, the townspeople lived their careful lives, always mindful of who was watching and what they might say. In a place where winter could kill you, and neighbors were your only lifeline, reputation mattered more than money. A good name could get you credit at the store, help when your roof leaked, or a place by the fire when the wolves came calling. A bad name could leave you dead in a ditch with nobody to mourn your passing. Lila had grown up understanding this delicate balance, raised in the shadow of her father's pulpit, where every word mattered and every action carried the weight of divine judgment. Reverend Isaiah Mercer had built his reputation on moral certitude and righteous fire, delivering sermons that could make grown men weep for their sins and wives examine their own hearts for hidden transgressions. He was a tall man, with silver threading through his dark beard, hands that could thunder against the lectern or comfort the grieving with equal conviction. But those same hands had trembled when Dr. Morrison confirmed what Lila herself had known for weeks. Those same hands had clenched into fists when she refused to name the father, protecting a man who had already fled town without so much as a farewell note. "You have brought shame upon this house," he had said that terrible evening 3 months ago, his voice hollow as a tomb. "Shame upon my ministry. Shame upon your mother's memory." The mention of her mother had cut deepest of all. Sarah Beth Mercer had died when Lila was 12, carried off by consumption that no amount of prayer or medicine could touch. She had been the gentle heart of their home, the one who balanced Isaiah's righteousness with tenderness, who read stories by lamplight and pressed wildflowers between the pages of her worn leather Bible. That Bible now sat on Lila's nightstand, its pages yellow with age and marked with her mother's careful notations in the margins. Lila could still remember her mother's voice, soft as summer rain. "Love is patient, my darling. Love is kind. It keeps no record of wrongs." But her father seemed to have forgotten those words, along with so many others that spoke of forgiveness and redemption. The pregnancy had not been born of love, though Lila had thought it might be at the time. Thomas Whitmore had been everything a young woman might dream of in a frontier town, handsome, charming, full of promises about the life they would build together. He had courted her properly for 6 months, attending church services and asking her father's permission to walk her home on Sunday evenings. He spoke of marriage, of a small ceremony in the spring, of children who would grow up knowing both their parents' love. But when autumn came and her monthly courses did not, Thomas had proven to be made of lesser stuff than his fine words suggested. The very night she told him about the child, he packed his belongings and caught the next stage out of town, leaving behind only a hastily scrawled note claiming urgent business in Denver. That had been 7 months ago, and Denver might as well have been the moon for all the chance she had of finding him. Now, as winter loosened its grip on the mountain valleys and spring struggled to assert itself, Lila faced a future as uncertain as the weather. Her father's congregation whispered behind their hands about the preacher's fallen daughter. The ladies of the church auxiliary had stopped inviting her to their quilting circles. Even her oldest friend, Mary Catherine, now crossed the street rather than speak to her in public. The isolation might have broken a weaker spirit, but Lila had inherited more than her mother's Bible. She had her father's backbone, even if she lacked his capacity for cold judgment. She had learned to find comfort in small things, the way morning light fell across her bedroom floor, the satisfaction of a well-tended garden, the movement of life within her womb that reminded her she was not entirely alone. Still, the loneliness cut deep, especially in the long hours after dark, when her father locked himself in his study to prepare sermons about sin and redemption that seemed directed more at his congregation than at his own heart. He had grown distant since her condition became known, speaking to her only when necessary, and then with the formal politeness he might show a stranger seeking charity. The house that had once rung with laughter and heated discussions about scripture now felt like a tomb. Meals passed in silence, broken only by the clink of silverware against china. Evening prayers had dwindled to perfunctory mutterings that carried no warmth, no hope, no acknowledgement that the woman sitting across from him had once been the apple of his eye. It was in this atmosphere of cold disappointment that Lila first heard the name Cade Rawlins spoken in connection with her future. She had been returning from the mercantile, her arms full of supplies for the evening meal, when she caught fragments of conversation drifting from her father's study. "Practical solution to your problem, Reverend," came a voice she recognized as belonging to Mayor Hutchins. "Man like that, he's used to taking care of strays." "I will not have my daughter treated as livestock," her father replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "Now, Isaiah, you know Cade's got a good reputation for treating his animals fair. Never heard tell of him being cruel to anything under his care. And Lord knows the man could use some company out there on that spread of his." Lila pressed herself against the hallway wall. Packages clutched to her chest, straining to hear more. Cade Rawlins was a name everyone in Cold Mercy knew, though few could claim to know the man himself. He owned a substantial ranch 15 miles north of town, running cattle and horses on land that stretched from the valley floor to the tree line. Folks said he was a veteran of the war between the states, that he had seen things that left him preferring the company of animals to people. He came to town perhaps once a month for supplies, a giant of a man who moved with surprising quiet for his size. Children stared at him from behind their mothers' skirts, and grown men stepped aside when he walked past. Not from fear, exactly, but from the kind of respect reserved for forces of nature, thunderstorms, avalanches, and men who carried their grief like boulders on their shoulders. "He's a good Christian man," Mayor Hutchins continued. "Pays his bills, keeps to himself, never caused trouble for anyone, and he's got that big house sitting empty except for himself." "What you're suggesting is barbaric," her father said, but again there was that telltale hesitation that spoke of a man grasping for solutions to an impossible problem. "What I'm suggesting is practical. The girl needs somewhere to go, and you need your reputation intact. Cade needs, well, Lord knows what Cade needs, but he's got the space and the means to provide for her. Might work out better than you think." Lila had heard enough. She crept back to the kitchen and set about preparing dinner with hands that shook like autumn leaves. The conversation continued in the study for another hour, voices rising and falling in the rhythm of negotiation. By the time her father called her to set the table, she could see in his eyes that some decision had been reached. But it would be 3 more days before he found the courage to tell her what that decision was. 3 days during which the weight of unspoken words hung over their house like smoke from a distant fire. 3 days during which Lila watched her father wrestle with his conscience and saw that conscience lose the battle, piece by piece, to his pride and his fear of what the town might say if he kept her under his roof much longer. When he finally spoke the words that would change her life forever, they would come not as a father's love seeking the best for his child, but as a preacher's judgment, seeking the preservation of his own salvation. And Lila would learn that sometimes the cruelest betrayals come wrapped in the language of necessity, delivered by those who claim to love us most. The confrontation came on a Thursday morning, when the March wind carried the promise of spring, but still held winter's bite. Lila was hanging laundry behind the house, her movements careful and deliberate, as her pregnancy had grown more pronounced with each passing week. The sheets snapped like flags of surrender in the gusting air, and she paused to press a hand to her lower back, where a persistent ache had settled. "Lila Jane." Her father's voice cut through the morning stillness with the same authority he used to call his congregation to repentance. "Come inside. We need to talk." She knew from his tone that the time for avoiding difficult conversations had passed. The way he stood in the doorway, his shoulders set and his mouth drawn into a hard line, told her that whatever decision had been brewing in his study these past days was about to be delivered like a final judgment. Inside the parlor, 2 men waited beside her father. Mayor Hutchins sat in the good chair, his hat balanced on his knees, and his face wearing the careful neutrality of a man conducting unpleasant business. The other man she recognized, but had never formally met Cade Rawlins himself, standing near the window, with his hat in his hands and his eyes fixed on something far beyond the glass. He was even larger than she remembered from her glimpses of him in town, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that stretched the seams of his worn work shirt. His hair was dark brown, touched with grey at the temples, and his face bore the weathered lines of a man who spent his days under the open sky. But it was his hands that drew her attention, scarred and calloused from years of hard work, yet somehow gentle in the way he held his hat, as if he understood that even inanimate objects deserved careful treatment. "Sit down, daughter." Her father's voice had taken on the formal cadence he used for serious church business. "Mr. Rawlins and I have reached an understanding about your situation." Lila lowered herself into the chair across from Mayor Hutchins, her heart beginning to race as the full implications of what was happening became clear. "My situation? Your condition has become a source of considerable difficulty for this household," her father continued, pacing behind his chair like a prosecutor before a jury. "As a man of God, I have a responsibility to my congregation, to this community, and to the reputation of the church itself. Your presence here, in your current state, undermines my ability to minister effectively to those who look to me for moral guidance." The words hit her like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage while maintaining the veneer of righteousness. "Father, I have prayed about this extensively. He cut her off, his voice growing stronger, as if drawing power from the familiar rhythms of moral certitude. And I believe the Lord has provided a solution that serves everyone's best interests. Mr. Rawlins has graciously agreed to take responsibility for you until such time as your situation resolves itself. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the mantel clock and the sound of wind rattling the windows. Lila stared at her father, waiting for him to explain that this was some elaborate joke, that the man who had raised her and taught her about God's love would never actually sell his own daughter like a piece of unwanted furniture. But his eyes held no warmth, no regret, no acknowledgement that the woman sitting before him had ever been anything more than an inconvenient burden to be disposed of. "You can't be serious," she whispered, her hand instinctively moving to protect her belly. "You can't just give me away." "I can and I will," her father replied with the finality of scripture. "Mr. Rawlins has agreed to provide for your needs until the child is born. After that, arrangements can be made for its care and your future." Mayor Hutchins cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Now, Lila, this is really for the best. Mr. Rawlins has a fine spread up north, plenty of room, and he's a God-fearing man who'll see you're treated proper." For the first time since entering the room, Cade Rawlins spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. "Begging your pardon, Mayor, but I think the lady should hear this from me direct." He turned from the window to face her, and Lila was startled by the kindness she saw in his dark eyes. They were the color of rich earth after rain, and they held none of the judgment or calculation she had grown accustomed to seeing in the faces around town. "Miss Mercer," he said, and his voice was gentle despite its depth, "I want you to know that this arrangement, if you agree to it, will be conducted with all the respect and propriety you deserve. You'll have your own room in the main house, your own space to do as you please. I won't ask anything of you, except to let me provide for your needs until you decide what you want to do next." "And if I refuse?" Lila asked, though she already knew the answer from the set of her father's jaw. "Then you're welcome to seek shelter wherever you can find it," her father said coldly. "But you will not do so under my roof or with my name to protect you." The cruelty of it took her breath away. In that moment, she saw her father clearly, for perhaps the first Timano as the righteous man of God she had always believed him to be, but as a weak man whose pride mattered more than his daughter's welfare, whose reputation meant more than the child he had raised and claimed to love. Mayor Hutchins shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "There are papers to be signed, of course, legal documents transferring responsibility and such. Nothing permanent, you understand, just until the situation stabilizes." "Papers," Lila repeated numbly. The words seemed to echo in the small room, reducing her entire existence to lines of ink on parchment. "It's all perfectly legal and proper," Mayor Hutchins assured her, producing a folded document from his jacket pocket. "Mr. Rawlins assumes responsibility for your care and maintenance, and in return receives certain considerations regarding your welfare and that of the child." Cade Rawlins stepped forward, his expression darkening. "Now hold on there, Mayor. We never discussed any considerations about the child. That's not what I agreed to." "Well, naturally, if you're providing for the mother, there are certain expectations." "The only expectation," Cade interrupted, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made both other men pause, "is that I provide a safe place for this young lady to have her baby in peace. Nothing more, nothing less." He looked directly at Lila then, and she saw something in his eyes that she had not seen in months: genuine concern for her well-being, rather than worry about what her presence might cost him. "Miss Mercer," he said carefully, "if you're willing to come stay at my place, I promise you'll be treated with respect. You'll have privacy, comfort, and safety for as long as you need it. And when you're ready to decide what comes next, that'll be your choice to make, not mine or anyone else's." The room fell silent again, as everyone waited for her response. Lila looked around at the faces surrounding her father's cold determination, Mayor Hutchins' bureaucratic discomfort, and Cade Rawlins' unexpected compassion. The choice, such as it was, seemed absurdly simple. She could stay and continue to endure her father's contempt and the town's whispered condemnation, growing heavier and more isolated with each passing day until the birth itself became just another source of shame to be hidden away. Or she could take a chance on the kindness she saw in a stranger's eyes, trusting that sometimes salvation came from the most unexpected places. "I'll need to pack my things," she said quietly. Her father nodded once, a sharp movement that spoke of business concluded and burdens lifted. "Mr. Rawlins will return for you tomorrow morning. Be ready." As the men filed out of the parlor to complete their arrangements, Lila remained in her chair, one hand resting on her belly where her child stirred restlessly, as if sensing the monumental change that was coming. Through the window, she could see Cade Rawlins speaking quietly with her father near the front gate, and she caught fragments of his words carried on the wind. "I built her a room with windows," he was saying, and something in his tone suggested this was both a promise and a warning. "She'll want to see the sky." For the first time in months, Lila felt something stirring in her chest that might have been hope. The journey to Cade Rawlins' ranch took most of the morning, winding through mountain passes where snow still clung to the shadows and early wildflowers dotted the meadows with splashes of color. Lila sat beside him on the wagon seat, her few possessions secured in the back alongside supplies from town, and tried not to think about how thoroughly her life had changed in the space of 24 hours. Cade drove with the easy competence of a man comfortable with horses and distance, speaking little but pointing out landmarks along the way. A creek where elk came to drink, a stand of aspen trees that turned gold in autumn, a rocky outcropping where eagles nested each spring. His voice when he spoke was gentle, free of the judgment she had grown accustomed to hearing in town. "That's my north pasture," he said as they crested a hill, and the ranch spread out below them. "Cattle winter there mostly, though I move them up higher come summer." Lila gazed down at the valley with something approaching wonder. The ranch house sat in a grove of cottonwood trees beside a creek that sparkled in the morning sun. It was larger than she had expected, built of logs and stone, with a wide front porch and windows that caught the light like welcoming eyes. Outbuildings dotted the property: barn, corrals, a chicken coop, and what looked like a workshop, all connected by well-worn paths and rail fences that spoke of careful maintenance and pride in the work. "It's beautiful," she said, meaning it. Cade glanced at her with surprise, as if he had expected criticism rather than appreciation. "Gets lonely sometimes, but it's good land. Been in my family since before the war." As they drew closer to the house, Lila could see more details that spoke to the character of the man beside her. The porch railings were carved with intricate patterns that suggested long winter evenings spent with careful hands and sharp tools. Flower boxes beneath the windows held the stubble of last year's plantings, waiting for someone to coax new life from their soil. A vegetable garden plot had been prepared for spring planting, the soil dark and rich and ready. "I've got the room ready for you," Cade said as he helped her down from the wagon, his hands gentle and brief in their contact. "It's got windows facing east and south, so you'll get good light most of the day." The interior of the house was as carefully maintained as the exterior, with wide plank floors polished smooth by years of use and furniture that spoke of quality rather than showiness. Quilts hung over chairbacks, and the stone fireplace showed signs of regular use. Books lined shelves built into the walls, and Lila caught titles that suggested a man of broader interests than his quiet demeanor might indicate. "Kitchen's through there," Cade said, setting her bags down near the staircase. "You're welcome to anything you need. I usually eat simple meat, bread, whatever vegetables I can manage from the garden, but if you know how to cook different, I'd be grateful for the change." He led her upstairs to a room that took her breath away. It was larger than her bedroom at home, with windows on 2 walls that looked out over the valley and mountains beyond. A quilt covered the bed, and someone, Cade, she realized, had placed wildflowers in a mason jar on the dresser, their yellow petals bright against the dark wood. But it was the piece of furniture in the corner that made her eyes fill with unexpected tears. A wooden cradle sat there, clearly handmade, with sides carved in the same intricate patterns she had noticed on the porch railings. The wood was smooth as silk, sanded and oiled until it gleamed, and lined with soft fabric that looked suspiciously like it had been cut from one of the quilts downstairs. "You made this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Cade shifted uncomfortably in the doorway, his big hands twisting the brim of his hat. "Figured you might need it come time. It's nothing fancy, but it's solid. Should last." Lila reached out to touch the smooth wood, overwhelmed by this evidence of thoughtfulness from a man who barely knew her. In town, people crossed the street to avoid acknowledging her condition. Her own father spoke of her pregnancy as a problem to be solved, rather than a life to be welcomed. But this stranger had spent hours crafting something beautiful for a child he would never claim, simply because he saw a need and chose to fill it. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," she said, and meant every word. "I'll leave you to get settled," Cade said, backing toward the door with the awkward haste of a man unaccustomed to emotional displays. "Supper's usually around 6, but don't feel obliged. You can eat when you want, sleep when you want. This is your home now, for as long as you need it." After he left, Lila sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the room that was somehow already more welcoming than the house where she had spent 19 years. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, warming her face and highlighting dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the golden air. For the first time in months, she felt something loosening in her chest, a knot of fear and shame that had grown so familiar, she had forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. That evening, she ventured downstairs to find Cade in the kitchen, wrestling with what appeared to be an ambitious attempt at biscuits. Flour dusted his shirt and the counter, and the expression on his face suggested that cooking was not among his natural talents. "Might I help?" she offered, and at his grateful nod, she took over the preparation while he set the table with the careful precision of a man determined to do things properly. They ate by lamplight, speaking little but comfortably, like old friends who didn't need words to fill every silence. Cade asked about her preferences for breakfast, whether she liked her coffee strong or weak, if there were foods that disagreed with her condition. Simple questions, practical concerns, but underneath them lay a consideration for her welfare that warmed her more than the fire crackling in the hearth. "Thank you," she said as they finished the meal, "for all of this, for the room, the cradle, for treating me like a person deserving of respect." Cade finished quietly. "That's not something you should have to thank anyone for, Miss Mercer. That's just how things ought to be." That night, Lila lay in her new bed, listening to the sounds of the ranch, settling around hearth, creak of wood expanding and contracting with the temperature, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the cottonwood trees. Through her window, she could see stars scattered across the mountain sky like scattered diamonds, and for the first time since learning about her pregnancy, she allowed herself to imagine a future that held something more than shame and sorrow. In the room below, she could hear Cade moving around the kitchen, banking the fire, and securing the house for the night. The sounds were comforting rather than intrusive, the careful actions of a man taking responsibility for those under his protection. When all was quiet, she placed her hand on her belly, where her child rested, and whispered a prayer of gratitude for whatever providence had led her to this place, to this man who saw her worth when she had almost forgotten it herself. Spring arrived at the ranch with gentle insistence, coaxing green shoots from the dark earth and filling the air with the promise of renewal. Lila had been there 2 weeks, and each day brought small revelations about the man who had taken her in and the life they were cautiously building together. She had discovered that Cade rose before dawn, moving through the house with surprising quiet for such a large man, always careful not to wake her as he prepared for the day's work. By the time she made her way downstairs, coffee would be waiting on the stove and eggs gathering in a basket by the back door, evidence of his morning rounds through the chicken coop. "You don't have to cook for me," he had said that first week, but she could see the pleasure in his eyes when she insisted on taking over the kitchen duties. It gave her purpose, a way to contribute to the household that didn't involve charity or pity. This morning, Like the others, she found him in the vegetable garden plot behind the house, turning soil that had been waiting all winter for attention. His shirt was already damp with perspiration despite the cool air, and dirt clung to his hands and forearms as he worked the stubborn earth into neat rows. "What will you plant?" she asked, settling carefully on the porch steps where she could watch him work. "The usual: potatoes, beans, carrots, onions, whatever keeps well through winter." He paused in his digging to look at her. "You have thoughts on the matter?" The question surprised her. Thomas had never asked her opinion about anything more substantial than what dress to wear to church. Her father made pronouncements rather than seeking input, but Cade seemed genuinely interested in her answer. "My mother used to grow herbs," she said, remembering Sarah Beth's small garden behind the parsonage. "Sage and thyme, parsley and dill. She said they made even simple food taste like celebration." "Herbs would be good," Cade agreed, resuming his work. "Haven't had much call for them, cooking just for myself, but I reckon that's about to change." Later that morning, Lila found a packet of wildflower seeds in the supply closet, clearly forgotten from some previous spring's ambitious plans. Without asking permission, she claimed a corner of the garden plot and scattered the seeds with the same faith her mother had shown in her herb garden trust, that something beautiful could grow from the simplest beginnings. As the days lengthened and warmed, she found herself venturing farther from the house, exploring the ranch with the careful steps of someone learning to trust her feet again. Cade had introduced her to the animals with the formal courtesy he might use for distinguished guests. There was Duchess, an ancient milk cow with wise eyes and a gentle disposition. The horses, Thunder, Belle, and Smoku, came to the fence when she approached, curious about this new presence in their domain. "They're good judges of character," Cade had said, watching Belle nuzzle Lila's palm in search of treats. "Animals know things about people that people sometimes miss about themselves." The chickens proved to be the most entertaining, a collection of hens with distinct personalities, and a rooster named Napoleon, who took his responsibilities seriously. Lila discovered that gathering eggs could be either a peaceful meditation or a military operation, depending on Napoleon's mood and whether he deemed her worthy of access to his ladies. "He's protective," Cade explained after Napoleon had chased her from the coop in a flurry of indignant squawking. "Can't fault him for that." In the evenings, after the animals were tended and the day's work complete, they fell into a comfortable routine of shared meals and quiet conversation. Cade proved to be a better listener than talker, asking thoughtful questions that encouraged her to speak about things she had kept locked away for months. "You miss teaching," he observed one evening, as she described her work at the small school in Cold Mercy, before her condition made it impossible to continue. "I miss the children," she said, surprised by how much the admission hurt. "They didn't care about my circumstances. They just wanted to learn their letters and hear stories." "You could teach again," Cade said carefully. "When you're ready. There are always children who need learning, and not all of them are lucky enough to live in towns with proper schools." The possibility had never occurred to her. In her father's house, her pregnancy had felt like an ending, the conclusion of all her dreams and aspirations. But here, watching the sun set over the valley while her child stirred restlessly in her womb, she could almost imagine a different kind of future. "Tell me about the war," she said one evening, recognizing in his eyes the same shadows she had seen in other veterans who had passed through Cold Mercy. Cade was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of memories too heavy for one man to bear alone. "Lost a lot of good men," he said simply. "Came home to find I'd lost my wife too. Consumption took her while I was gone, and nobody thought to write and tell me until it was too late for goodbyes." The pain in his voice made her chest tighten with sympathy. "I'm sorry." "Me too." He stared into the fire for a moment before continuing. "Used to think this place was too quiet, too empty. But quiet's not so bad when it's the right kind of quiet. When it's peaceful instead of just hollow." She understood what he meant. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with understanding rather than judgment. It was the kind of quiet that came from shared understanding, from two people who had both learned that life could disappoint you in ways you never expected, but still surprise you with unexpected grace. "Cade," she said, using his name for the first time since arriving at the ranch. "Why did you agree to take me in? Really?" He looked at her then, his dark eyes serious and honest. "Because nobody deserves to be thrown away like rubbish, especially not when they're carrying life. And because this place needed someone who could see its beauty instead of just its loneliness." That night, as she watched her wildflower seeds beginning to sprout in neat green rows, Lila realized that something was growing inside her too, not just the child she carried, but hope itself, taking root in soil that had seemed barren just weeks before. For the first time since leaving her father's house, she allowed herself to think that maybe, just maybe, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The discovery came by accident on a warm May morning when Lila was helping Cade organize his cluttered desk in search of receipts for the tax assessor. She had been staying at the ranch for 6 weeks, and their easy partnership had extended to household tasks that he had clearly been neglecting for years. "You keep your important papers in the oddest places," she said, pulling a deed from between the pages of a veterinary manual. "How do you ever find anything?" "I mostly don't," Cade admitted, sorting through a stack of correspondence that dated back several years. "Never was much good at the business side of ranching. I just know how to work the land and care for the animals." It was while reaching for a ledger on the highest shelf that her fingers brushed against something unexpected, a small wooden box pushed far back behind the books. When she brought it down, Cade's entire body went still, his face draining of color as he recognized what she held. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, seeing his distress. "I didn't mean to pry." "It's all right," he said, though his voice had gone hoarse. "I'd forgotten it was there." The box was made of the same fine wood as her cradle, polished smooth by handling and age. Inside, nestled in faded blue velvet, lay a military Medaltha bronze star, she realized, recognizing it from illustrations she had seen in newspapers during the war. Beneath it was a small daguerreotype of a young woman with gentle eyes and a smile that spoke of quiet happiness. "Your wife," Lila said softly, not a question, but a statement of understanding. "Mary Elizabeth." Cade's voice was barely above a whisper. She was. She was everything good about this place, everything I was fighting to come home to. Lila studied the photograph, seeing in the woman's face the kind of serene beauty that came from deep contentment rather than mere physical features. This was someone who had been truly loved, truly cherished, and the knowledge of what Cade had lost made her heart ache for him. She would have been a wonderful mother, she said, instinctively understanding that this was at the heart of his grief. She wanted children more than anything, Cade confirmed, taking the photograph with reverent care. "We tried for 3 years before I left for the war. She was so sure that by the time I came home, but the consumption took that dream along with everything else." "Tell me about her," Lila said, settling into the chair across from him. "What was she like?" For a moment she thought he would refuse, but then something in his expression softened, as if he had been waiting years for someone to ask that question. "She laughed at everything," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Used to say that life was too hard to waste time being grim about it. She could find joy in the smallest things, a butterfly in the garden, a good crop of tomatoes, the way morning light fell across our kitchen table." As he spoke, Lila could see Mary Elizabeth taking shape in her mind, a woman who had filled this house with warmth and laughter, who had made Cade believe in possibilities beyond mere survival. No wonder the place had felt hollow to him after her death. No wonder he had retreated into solitude rather than try to rebuild what they had shared. "She sounds wonderful," Lila said, meaning it completely. "She was, and she would have liked you." Cade looked up from the photograph to meet her eyes. "She would have said you had a strong spirit, that you'd survived things that would have broken lesser women. She always could see the best in people, even when they couldn't see it themselves." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching the house, unusual enough to make them both look toward the window with concern. Visitors were rare at the ranch, and unannounced visitors were virtually unheard of. "Stay here," Cade said, but Lila was already moving toward the window to peer through the curtains. 3 men sat on horseback in the yard, their clothes marking them as townspeople rather than neighboring ranchers. She recognized one of them, Dr. Morrison, who had confirmed her pregnancy what seemed like a lifetime ago. The other 2 were strangers, but their bearing suggested official business of some kind. "Dr. Morrison's here," she said, her stomach clenching with sudden anxiety. "With 2 men I don't recognize." Cade cursed under his breath, carefully placing his wife's photograph back in its box. "Probably the territorial health inspector and a deputy marshal. I was wondering when they'd show up." "What do they want?" "To make sure you're being treated properly. I'd guess. Your father's been getting questions from the church hierarchy about his daughter's sudden disappearance. Had to provide some kind of official explanation." Lila felt a chill that had nothing to do with the spring air. "They want to take me back." "Not if I have anything to say about it." Cade's voice carried a quiet determination that reminded her of the military bearing she could sometimes glimpse beneath his civilian gentleness. "But they'll want to inspect the arrangements, ask questions, make sure everything's legal and proper." The knock on the front door was firm and official. Cade straightened his shoulders and walked to answer it, every inch the respectable rancher welcoming unexpected guests. Lila heard the murmur of voices, formal introductions, the kind of careful politeness that preceded difficult conversations. "Miss Mercer," Dr. Morrison said as she entered the parlor, his tone professionally neutral. "You're looking well." "Thank you, Dr. Morrison, I'm feeling very well." The health inspector, a thin man, with wire-rimmed spectacles and the demeanor of someone who found fault with everything he examined, looked around the room with obvious skepticism. "I am Inspector Hartwell from the Territorial Capital. We've received complaints about the irregular nature of your living arrangements here." "Complaints from whom?" Cade asked, though they all knew the answer. "Concerned citizens who question whether proper moral standards are being maintained," the deputy marshal said. He was younger than the others, with the nervous energy of a man eager to prove his authority. "There are laws about unmarried persons of opposite genders cohabitating, especially when one party is in a delicate condition." "Miss Mercer has her own quarters," Cade said evenly. "She receives proper care and supervision. I fail to see what laws might be violated by Christian charity." "Christian charity is one thing," Inspector Hartwell said, producing a notebook and pencil. "But the appearance of impropriety is quite another. I'll need to examine the living arrangements and speak with Miss Mercer privately to ensure she is here of her own free will." The next hour passed in a blur of questions, inspections, and barely concealed accusations. The men examined her room, questioned her about her daily routine, and asked pointed questions about the nature of her relationship with Cade that made her face burn with embarrassment and anger. Through it all, Cade remained calm and respectful, answering their inquiries with the patience of a man who had nothing to hide. But Lila could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened when they implied that he might be taking advantage of her vulnerable situation. "Everything appears to be in order," Dr. Morrison said finally, his tone suggesting that he was not entirely pleased with this conclusion. "Miss Mercer seems to be receiving adequate care." "More than adequate," she said firmly, finding her voice at last. "Mr. Rawlins has shown me nothing but kindness and respect. I am here by choice, and I am grateful for his protection." The words seemed to surprise them, as if they had expected to find a frightened, mistreated woman grateful for rescue. Instead, they found someone who spoke with quiet dignity about her circumstances and clear appreciation for the man who had given her sanctuary. After they left, Lila and Cade sat in the parlor, both drained by the encounter. The medal and photograph still lay on the desk between them, reminders of the conversation that had been interrupted by official scrutiny. "This won't be the end of it," Cade said quietly. "Your father's not going to let this rest. He needs to prove that his decision was righteous, that you're being properly managed." "Then what do we do?" Cade looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something shifting in his expression, a decision being made, a line being drawn. "We make sure they have nothing to complain about," he said. "We make this arrangement so respectable, so unquestionably proper, that even your father can't find fault with it." Lila had the distinct feeling that he was talking about something more than just maintaining separate quarters and observing social proprieties. But whatever plan was forming in his mind, she trusted him to handle it with the same careful consideration he had shown her from the very beginning. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early June, delivered by a rider who wouldn't meet Lila's eyes as he handed over the envelope. Her name was written across the front in handwriting she recognized with a sinking, heart-bold, confident strokes that had once seemed romantic but now felt like a threat. Thomas Whitmore had found her. Lila sat on the porch steps, the unopened letter trembling in her hands as she watched the messenger disappear down the valley road. Her child had grown active in recent weeks, responding to her moods with restless movement that reminded her constantly of the life she carried and the choices that lay ahead. "Bad news?" Cade asked, emerging from the barn where he had been shoeing one of the horses. He took one look at her face and set down his tools, his expression darkening with concern. "It's from Thomas," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "the father of my child." Cade's entire body went still, the way she had seen him react when a storm was approaching, or when something had spooked the cattle. "What does he want?" "I don't know. I haven't opened it yet." She stared at the envelope, as if it might burst into flames at any moment. "I thought he was gone forever. It's been almost 8 months since he left." "Maybe we should read it together," Cade suggested gently, settling beside her on the steps. "Whatever it says, you don't have to face it alone." With shaking fingers, Lila broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter. Thomas's handwriting filled a single page, the words as careless and self-serving as the man who had written them. "My dear Lila," she read aloud, her voice growing steadier with anger. "I have recently learned of your situation and current circumstances through mutual acquaintances in Denver. I must say I am disturbed to hear that you have taken up residence with a stranger rather than waiting for my return to properly address our situation." Cade made a sound low in his throat that might have been a growl. "Our situation? The man abandons you and then has the nerve to claim ownership." Lila continued reading, each word stoking the fire of her indignation. "I have concluded my business affairs here and am prepared to return to Cold Mercy to claim what is rightfully mine. I expect you to conduct yourself with appropriate discretion until I arrive to make the necessary arrangements for our marriage and the proper raising of my child." "His child," Cade repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "There's more." Lila's hands were shaking again, but with fury rather than fear. "I trust you will see the wisdom of ending your current inappropriate arrangement immediately. A woman in your condition should not be living in sin with a man who has no legal claim to her welfare. I will arrive by the end of the month to collect you and make proper provision for our family." The letter was signed with Thomas's full name and a flourish that suggested he considered the matter settled by his mere declaration of intent. For several minutes they sat in silence, the weight of Thomas's presumption settling between them like a stone. The morning that had begun with such peaceful promise now felt charged with the threat of upheaval, of having the careful sanctuary they had built together torn apart by a man who had forfeited any right to claim either Lila or her child. "He thinks he can just waltz back here and pick up where he left off," Lila said finally, her voice tight with controlled rage. "As if the past 8 months never happened. As if I've been sitting here like some faithful dog waiting for him to remember I exist." "What do you want to do?" Cade asked, and the question surprised her with its simplicity. Not what she should do, or what was proper, or what others might expect what she wanted. "I want to burn this letter and pretend I never received it," she said honestly. "I want Thomas Whitmore to disappear, back to wherever he came from, and leave us in peace." "Us," Cade repeated softly, and something in his tone made her look at him more closely. "Cade, She stopped, realizing what she had revealed in her moment of emotional honesty. "I didn't mean to presume." "You weren't presuming anything," he said, his dark eyes serious and intent. "These past months, watching you bloom here, watching you find your strength again, it's been like seeing the ranch come back to life. You belong here, Lila." Not because of some legal arrangement or charitable obligation, but because this place needs you the way the earth needs rain. The admission hung between them, more intimate than any physical touch could have been. Lila felt her heart racing, not with fear but with a recognition that had been building for weeks, the understanding that what had begun as rescue had grown into something far deeper and more precious. "But Thomas has legal rights," she said, trying to be practical, even as her heart yearned toward the possibility Cade was offering. "He is the father, and unmarried women have few protections under the law. Legal rights can be challenged," Cade said firmly. "A man who abandons a woman when she needs him most, who leaves her to face shame and hardship alone, that's not a father. That's just a man who happened to plant a seed." The fierce protectiveness in his voice reminded her of Napoleon defending his hens, but there was something more here, a depth of caring that went beyond mere chivalry or duty. "What are you saying, Cade?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the valley where their wildflowers had begun to bloom in brilliant patches of color among the green grass. When he spoke, his words were careful, deliberate, weighted with significance. "I'm saying that if you were my wife, legally and properly, Thomas Whitmore would have no claim on you or your child. I'm saying that what we've built here doesn't have to end just because some fool finally remembered his responsibilities." Lila's breath caught in her throat. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm asking if you'd consider it," Cade said, turning to face her fully. "Not because you need protection, though I'd be honored to provide it. Not because it would solve our immediate problem, though it would. I'm asking because somewhere, in these past months, watching you plant flowers and teach Napoleon proper manners and turn this house back into a home, I fell in love with you." The words seemed to hang in the morning air like music, beautiful and unexpected and perfect in their simplicity. Lila looked at this man who had shown her nothing but kindness, who had seen her worth when she had forgotten it herself, who was offering not just his name and protection, but his heart. "I love you too," she whispered, the admission feeling like a prayer. "I think I have for weeks now, but I was afraid to hope." "Hope's not something to be afraid of," Cade said, reaching for her hands with the gentle reverence she had come to associate with all his gestures toward her. "Not when it's grounded in truth." He leaned forward then, slowly and carefully, giving her every opportunity to pull away. When she didn't, when she instead tilted her face up toward his, he kissed her with a tenderness that spoke of patience and deep affection rather than mere passion. "We'll need to act quickly," he said when they broke apart, his forehead resting against hers. "If Thomas is planning to arrive by month's end, we should be married before then. Make it impossible for him to challenge our legal standing." "The preacher in town won't marry us," Cade finished grimly. "Not with your father's opposition and the questions about your condition, but there's a circuit judge who comes through Copper Falls once a month. Judge Harrison, he's a fair man, more concerned with justice than appearances." As they sat together planning their future, Lila felt the last of her fears dissolving like morning mist. Thomas's letter, which had seemed like such a threat just minutes ago, now felt like nothing more than the desperate bluster of a man who had already lost everything that mattered. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them not as Isaiah Mercer's disgraced daughter or Thomas Whitmore's abandoned woman, but as Lila Rawlins' wife, partner, and beloved companion to a man who had shown her what true love looked like. The journey to Copper Falls took most of the day, winding through mountain passes that Lila had never seen before. She sat beside Cade on the wagon seat, wearing her mother's best dress navy blue, with tiny pearl buttons that she had let out as much as possible to accommodate her condition. In her lap she held a small bouquet of wildflowers from their garden, the same varieties she had planted that first hopeful morning at the ranch. Judge Harrison proved to be a weathered man in his 60s, with kind eyes and the practical manner of someone who had spent his career dealing with the realities of frontier life rather than its idealized version. His temporary courthouse was the back room of the Copper Falls Hotel, where he conducted business with the efficient dignity of a man who understood that legal ceremonies should be meaningful rather than merely formal. Mr. Rawlins, Miss Mercer, he said, looking up from the papers Cade had presented. I understand you wish to be married today. Yes, sir, Cade replied, his hand finding Lila's with gentle reassurance. We have the license and witnesses. The witnesses were the hotel proprietor and his wife, strangers who had agreed to serve in this capacity with the casual kindness that frontier communities showed to those in need of assistance. They stood quietly in the corner, respectful of the solemnity of the moment. Miss Mercer, Judge Harrison said, his tone gentle but direct. Are you entering into this marriage of your own free will, without coercion or undue influence? I am, Lila said firmly, meaning every word. And you understand that marriage is a legal contract with responsibilities and obligations that cannot be easily dissolved? We do, they answered together. The ceremony itself was simple but dignified, the judge's words carrying the weight of law and tradition without unnecessary elaboration. When Cade slipped a simple gold band onto her finger run he had purchased that morning from the general store, Lila felt something fundamental shift inside her. She was no longer Isaiah Mercer's disgraced daughter or Thomas Whitmore's abandoned woman. She was Lila Rawlins, wife and partner to a man who loved her. The ride home was peaceful, filled with the comfortable silence of two people who had just made a momentous decision and found it good. The late afternoon sun painted the valley in shades of gold and green, and their ranch, their home, looked more beautiful than ever as they crested the final hill. But as they drew closer to the house, Lila noticed something that made her stomach clench with sudden anxiety. 3 horses stood tied to the front porch rail, and smoke rose from the chimney despite the warm weather signs of visitors who had made themselves at home in their absence. Stay close to me, Cade said quietly, his hand moving instinctively to check the rifle secured beneath the wagon seat. They were still 50 yards from the house when the front door opened and 3 men emerged onto the porch. Thomas Whitmore led the group, looking every inch the successful businessman in his fine clothes and polished boots. Behind him came Mayor Hutchins, his face wearing the careful neutrality of a politician trying to navigate troubled waters. The third man was a stranger well-dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Lila, Thomas called out as if greeting a beloved friend rather than the woman he had abandoned 8 months earlier. Thank God you're safe. When I arrived and found you missing, I feared the worst. Cade brought the wagon to a stop in front of the porch, his body radiating the controlled tension of a man preparing for conflict. Whitmore, I wasn't expecting you for another week. I was able to conclude my business earlier than anticipated. Thomas replied, his eyes fixed on Lila with an intensity that made her skin crawl. I came as soon as I received word about Lila's situation. Her situation is perfectly respectable, Cade said evenly, helping Lila down from the wagon with careful attention to her condition. Living in sin with a stranger while carrying my child. Thomas's voice carried the righteous indignation of a man who had convinced himself he was the injured party. I think not. Actually, Lila said, finding her voice and her courage, my situation is that of a properly married woman. Mr. Rawlins and I were wed this afternoon by Judge Harrison in Copper Falls. The silence that followed her announcement was so complete that she could hear the wind rustling through the cottonwood trees. Thomas's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, and finally a rage so pure it made his features ugly. Impossible, he sputtered. You can't marry someone else while carrying my child. It's not legal, it's not moral. It's perfectly legal, the stranger said, stepping forward with the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard. I am attorney Charles Brennan from Denver. Mr. Whitmore engaged my services to ensure the proper resolution of this matter. However, if what you say is true, Mrs. Rawlins, is it? Then the situation has become considerably more complex. Cade reached into his jacket and produced their marriage certificate, the ink still fresh and the judge's seal clearly visible. Mrs. Rawlins is my wife in every legal sense. Her previous relationship with Mr. Whitmore, whatever its nature, was never formalized through marriage. He has no legal claim on her whatsoever. Attorney Brennan examined the document with the thoroughness of a man trained to find flaws in legal proceedings. After several minutes, he looked up with obvious frustration. "The marriage appears to be entirely valid. Mr. Whitmore, I'm afraid your position has become untenable." "My position?" Thomas's voice rose to something approaching a shout. "That's my child she's carrying, my blood. You can't tell me I have no rights to my own offspring." "Actually, I can," Brennan said with professional detachment. "Under territorial law, a child born in wedlock is presumed to be the child of the husband, regardless of the biological circumstances. Mrs. Rawlins' child will be legally considered Mr. Rawlins' child from the moment of birth." The implications of this hit Thomas like a physical blow. He had been so confident in his righteousness, so certain that his mere appearance would resolve everything in his favor, that he hadn't considered the possibility that Lila might have moved beyond waiting for his return. "This is outrageous," he declared, turning to Mayor Hutchins as if expecting support. "You can't allow this travesty to stand. The woman was practically given to this man like property. The marriage is clearly a sham, designed to prevent me from claiming what's rightfully mine." "Now see here, young man," Mayor Hutchins said uncomfortably, "the Rawlins marriage may have been sudden, but it appears to be entirely legal. And given your own absence during the lady's time of need, I'm not sure you're in a position to make demands." Lila watched this exchange with growing amazement. For months, she had lived in fear of this confrontation, imagining Thomas as a figure of overwhelming authority who could sweep back into her life and reclaim control. Instead, she saw him for what he really was, selfish man who had expected the world to remain frozen in place while he pursued his own interests. "Thomas," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of a woman who had found her strength, "you made your choice 8 months ago when you left me to face this alone. I've made mine today. Mr. Rawlins, me husband, has shown me more kindness and respect in 3 months than you managed in 6 months of courtship. But the child will be raised by parents who love and want it." Lila interrupted firmly, "by a father who carved its cradle with his own hands and a mother who will teach it that real love means staying, even when times are difficult." Thomas looked around the group, seeking any ally in his cause, but found only faces that ranged from hostile to merely unsympathetic. Even Attorney Brennan, despite being paid for his services, seemed to recognize the futility of challenging a legal marriage based on moral outrage alone. "This isn't over," Thomas said finally, his voice tight with frustrated anger. "I'll find a way to challenge this mockery. That child belongs to me." "No," Cade said, speaking for the first time since presenting their marriage certificate. His voice was quiet, but carried the unmistakable authority of a man defending his family. "That child belongs to the family that wants it, protects it, and will love it every day of its life. You're not part of that family, Whitmore. You never were." As the 3 men prepared to leave, defeated in their mission but unwilling to acknowledge it gracefully, Lila felt a profound sense of completion. The future she had feared for so many months, a future dominated by shame, obligation, and loveless duty, had been replaced by something infinitely better. She was Mrs. Rawlins now, partner to a man who had proven his love through action rather than words, mother to a child who would grow up knowing security and acceptance rather than shame. And as she watched Thomas Whitmore ride away, disappearing into the gathering twilight like the bad dream he had always been, she knew that sometimes the greatest victories came not from fighting, but from choosing a different battlefield entirely. The weeks following Thomas's departure brought an unexpected peace to the ranch, as if the very air had been cleansed of the tension that had hung over them since his letter arrived. Lila settled into her new role as Mrs. Rawlins with a contentment that surprised her in its completeness. The gold band on her finger caught the morning light as she gathered eggs, and she found herself pausing to admire it not for its modest beauty, but for what it represented. She was no longer alone. More than that, she was truly wanted. July brought the full heat of summer to the valley, and with it, the constant activity of a working ranch. Lila had grown large with child, her movements careful but determined as she refused to let her condition render her useless. Cade worried constantly about her overexerting herself, but she had discovered that physical activity helped manage the restless energy that came with the final months of pregnancy. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," he said one morning as he found her in the garden, weeding between the rows of vegetables despite the early-hour heat. "Least of all to me." "I'm not trying to prove anything," she replied, straightening with one hand pressed to her lower back. "I'm trying to be useful. This baby's going to come whether I sit in a chair all day or keep working. I'd rather be productive." The vegetables they had planted together in the spring had flourished beyond either of their expectations. Tomatoes hung heavy on their vines, beans climbed their poles with eager abundance, and the herb garden had become a fragrant paradise that made even simple meals taste like celebrations. Lila had discovered that she possessed her mother's gift for coaxing life from the earth, and the evidence of that gift surrounded them in green profusion. But it was the wildflower patch that drew her attention most often. The seeds she had scattered that first hopeful morning had grown into a riot of color-purple lupines, yellow coreopsis, red Indian paintbrush, and white yarrow that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds in delightful abundance. Looking at them, she could measure the distance she had traveled from the frightened, shamed woman who had arrived at the ranch 4 months ago. The transformation was not lost on the neighbors either. Word of their marriage had spread through the mountain communities with the speed that news always traveled in sparsely populated areas. Some of the responses had been predictably judgmental whispered, comments about hasty weddings and questionable circumstances. But others had surprised her with their warmth and acceptance. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, whose ranch lay 10 miles to the west, had arrived one afternoon with a basket of baby clothes and a matter-of-fact manner that brooked no embarrassment. "Every child needs proper clothing," she had said, unpacking tiny gowns and blankets with the efficiency of a woman who had raised 6 children of her own. "These belong to my youngest, and they're too good to waste." "Mrs. Patterson, I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything. Just raise that baby with love and teach it right from wrong. That's all any of us can do." The Hendricks family from the next valley had sent their eldest son with an offer to help with the heavier ranch work as Lila's time drew near. Even crusty old Pete Morrison, who ran cattle on the far side of the mountain, had stopped by to offer his congratulations and share a bottle of whiskey with Cade in celebration of the marriage. "Takes a strong woman to make a go of it out here," he had said, nodding approvingly at Lila's obvious contentment. "And takes a wise man to recognize one when he sees her." But along with the acceptance came other, more troubling developments. Dr. Morrison had stopped by twice in recent weeks, ostensibly to check on Lila's condition, but clearly fishing for information about the circumstances of her marriage. His questions had a pointed quality that suggested someone was encouraging his curiosity. "Everything appears normal," he had said after his most recent examination, "though I confess surprise at how settled you seem, given the unusual circumstances of your situation." "What's unusual about a woman being happy in her marriage?" Lila had asked, her voice carrying an edge that made the doctor step back slightly. "Nothing, of course. Nothing at all. I simply meant, that is, the timing of events." "The timing of events is our business, Dr. Morrison," Cade had interjected with quiet firmness. "I trust you'll respect our privacy in that regard." More concerning had been the letter from her father that arrived the day after Dr. Morrison's second visit. It was the first communication she had received from him since leaving Cold Mercy, and its contents were as cold and judgmental as she had expected. "Lila," she read aloud to Cade that evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "I have been informed of your recent marriage and find myself deeply disturbed by the haste and circumstances of this union. While I cannot prevent what has already been done, I feel compelled to warn you that Mr. Whitmore has not abandoned his claims regarding the child you carry. He has consulted with legal authorities and may seek to challenge your marriage on grounds of fraud and deception." Cade's jaw tightened as she continued reading. Furthermore, questions have been raised about the propriety of your living arrangements prior to the wedding ceremony. Several members of my congregation have expressed concern that your marriage may have been contracted solely to avoid the legal consequences of immoral behavior. The man has quite an imagination, Cade said grimly. There's more. Lila's voice had grown steadier with anger. I feel it is my Christian duty to inform you that I cannot in good conscience acknowledge this marriage or any children that may result from it. You have made your choice, and you must live with the consequences. Do not expect support or recognition from your family in this matter. She folded the letter carefully, her hands remarkably steady, despite the emotional impact of her father's rejection. He's disowning me, officially and completely. Are you surprised? Lila considered the question seriously before answering. No, disappointed, but not surprised. My father was always more concerned with appearances than with people, even when I was a child. I suppose I hoped that becoming a grandmother might soften him, but that was naive. His loss, Cade said simply, reaching for her hand. Any man who would disown his own daughter for choosing love over shame isn't much of a father to begin with. The words were comforting, but they couldn't entirely ease the sadness that came with having her fears confirmed. She was truly alone in the world now, except for the man beside her and the child growing within her. It was both terrifying and liberating the knowledge that she had no safety net except what she and Cade built together. As if sensing her thoughts, the baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly strong kick that made her gasp and press both hands to her belly. Active tonight, Cade observed, his eyes crinkling with the gentle humor she had come to love. Very active. I think this child is going to be a handful. Takes after its mother, then. The teasing comment was delivered with such obvious affection that Lila felt her melancholy lifting despite the weight of her father's rejection. This was her family now, this quiet, strong man who had shown her what real love looked like, and the child who would complete their small circle. But even as she treasured these peaceful moments, Lila could not shake the feeling that they were living in a brief calm before a storm. Thomas's threats, her father's warnings, the pointed questions from Dr. Morrison, all of these suggested that their carefully constructed new life was still vulnerable to outside interference. The feeling proved prophetic when a rider arrived the next morning with news that made Cade's face go pale with concern. Thomas Whitmore had returned to Cold Mercy, this time accompanied by a territorial judge and a marshal carrying legal documents that challenged the validity of their marriage. He's claiming fraud, the messenger explained, a young man who clearly relished being the bearer of dramatic news. Says you coerced Miss Mercer, Mrs. Rawlins, into marrying you to avoid facing charges for harboring a woman in immoral circumstances. Says the whole thing was a sham to cover up improper relations. That's ridiculous, Lila said, her voice sharp with indignation. Maybe so, Ma'am, but Judge Carmichael takes these things serious. He's ordered you both to appear in Cold Mercy tomorrow for a formal hearing. Says if you don't show, he'll issue a warrant for your arrest. As the messenger rode away, leaving them to absorb this new crisis, Lila felt the ground shifting beneath her feet once again. Just when she had found safety and happiness, just when she had begun to believe that the worst was behind them, the past had reached out to drag her back into uncertainty. "What do we do?" she asked, hating the note of fear that had crept into her voice. Cade was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes fixed on the mountains that ringed their valley like protective walls. When he spoke, his voice carried the same quiet determination she had heard the day he first brought her to the ranch. "We go to Cold Mercy," he said simply. "We tell the truth, and we fight for what's ours." The words were brave, but as Lila looked toward the town that had been so eager to cast her out, she wondered if the truth would be enough to protect the life they had built together. Tomorrow would bring the final test of whether love could truly triumph over the forces of shame and judgment that had ruled her life for so long. The courthouse in Cold Mercy had never seemed so imposing as it did on that sweltering August morning when Lila and Cade arrived to defend their marriage. The building, which normally served as a meeting hall for town functions, had been transformed into a formal court with Judge Carmichael's bench positioned beneath the large window that faced Main Street. Half the town seemed to have gathered for the proceedings, filling every available seat and lining the walls with the eager anticipation of spectators at a prize fight. Lila walked slowly up the courthouse steps, her hand resting on Cade's steady arm for support. At 8 months pregnant, every movement required careful consideration, but she held her head high as she passed through the crowd of familiar faces. Some watched with open hostility, others with curiosity, but a few like Mrs. Patterson and the Hendricks family offered encouraging nods that reminded her she was not entirely without allies. Thomas Whitmore sat at the plaintiff's table with Attorney Brennan, his expression radiating the confidence of a man certain of victory. He had dressed for the occasion in his finest suit, every inch the successful businessman seeking justice against rural fraudsters. When Lila entered the room, his eyes fixed on her swollen figure with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Judge Carmichael was a stern-faced man in his 50s, appointed by the territorial government and known for his strict interpretation of the law. He called the proceedings to order with the sharp rap of his gavel, and the murmur of conversation died immediately. "This court is convened to hear the matter of Whitmore versus Rawlins," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. "Mr. Whitmore seeks to have the marriage between Mr. Cade Rawlins and the former Miss Lila Mercer declared invalid on grounds of fraud and coercion." Attorney Brennan rose smoothly to present his case, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man accustomed to commanding attention. "Your Honor, my client, Mr. Thomas Whitmore, was engaged in legitimate business in Denver when he learned that the woman carrying his child had been essentially sold to Mr. Rawlins by her father. Rather than wait for Mr. Whitmore's return to properly address the situation, Mr. Rawlins took advantage of Miss Mercer's vulnerable condition to enter into a fraudulent marriage designed solely to prevent Mr. Whitmore from claiming his parental rights. The words painted Lila as a helpless victim and Cade as a scheming opportunist, reducing their love to a mere legal maneuver. She felt Cade's hand tighten on hers, but his expression remained calm as Brennan continued his attack. "Furthermore, Your Honor, we have evidence that Mr. Rawlins and Miss Mercer were living in immoral circumstances for months prior to their hasty wedding ceremony. Dr. Morrison will testify that he observed clear signs of intimate relations between the defendants, making their marriage nothing more than an attempt to legitimize sinful behavior." A murmur ran through the courtroom at this accusation, and Lila felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. The lies came so easily to these men, wrapped in legal language that made slander sound like justice. "Mr. Whitmore seeks custody of his unborn child and compensation for the emotional distress caused by the defendant's deceptive actions," Brennan concluded. "We ask this court to declare the marriage void and restore my client's rightful position as father to the child in question." Judge Carmichael nodded gravely and turned to the defense table where Cade and Lila sat with the young lawyer they had managed to engage from a neighboring town. Samuel Crawford was barely out of law school, but he had the passionate idealism of youth and a genuine belief in justice that more experienced attorneys might have lost. "Mr. Crawford, you may present your defense." Crawford stood, his nervous energy evident as he addressed the court. "Your Honor, this case represents nothing more than the desperate attempt of a man who abandoned his responsibilities to reclaim what he discarded when it became inconvenient. Whitmore left Miss Mercer to face shame and hardship alone. Mr. Rawlins offered her protection, respect, and eventually his name in marriage union entered into freely and with genuine affection. The young lawyer's voice grew stronger as he warmed to his argument. "The marriage certificate is valid, properly executed by Judge Harrison in Copper Falls. Mrs. Rawlins will testify that she entered the union willingly, motivated by love rather than legal convenience. This court should not reward abandonment by punishing the good man who stepped forward when Mr. Whitmore failed in his duties." As Crawford spoke, Lila noticed movement near the back of the courtroom. Her father had entered quietly, his presence commanding immediate attention from those who recognized him. Reverend Isaiah Mercer walked slowly down the center aisle, his face grave as he took a seat in the front row. The sight of him sent a chill through her. Had he come to support Thomas's claims? To publicly disown her before the entire community? Judge Carmichael called for the first witness, and Dr. Morrison took the stand with obvious reluctance. Under Brennan's questioning, he testified about his visits to the ranch, carefully implying impropriety without making direct accusations that could be easily challenged. "In your professional opinion, Dr. Morrison," Brennan asked, "did Mrs. Rawlins appear to be a woman who had entered marriage freely, or one who might have been coerced by circumstances?" Before Dr. Morrison could answer, the courthouse bell began to toll, not the regular hourly chime, but the urgent rhythm used to call the community together in times of crisis. The sound seemed to echo through the building like a divine judgment, demanding attention and bearing witness to the truth about to be revealed. Dr. Morrison's testimony faltered as the bell continued its urgent tolling, and Judge Carmichael frowned at the interruption. But before he could call for order, Lila felt a familiar tightening in her belly, different from the usual discomfort, sharper and more insistent. She gripped Cade's hand, her face going pale as understanding dawned. "The baby," she whispered, and the words seemed to carry through the suddenly quiet courtroom. Cade's chair scraped against the wooden floor as he stood immediately, his protective instincts overriding all legal protocols. "Your Honor, my wife needs medical attention." "Now see here," Thomas protested, rising from his seat with obvious irritation. "This is clearly a ploy to avoid." His words were cut short as Lila doubled over with a sharp cry, her hand pressed to her belly as another contraction seized her. The reality of the situation became immediately apparent to everyone in the courtroom, and the legal proceedings suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the drama of impending birth. Dr. Morrison abandoned the witness stand without being dismissed, his professional instincts taking precedence over legal formalities. "We need to get her somewhere she can lie down," he said, moving quickly to Lila's side. "This baby's not waiting for your hearing to conclude." "She can't leave," Attorney Brennan insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "The court must resolve this matter before." "The court," Judge Carmichael interrupted with surprising firmness, "will not interfere with the birth of a child. This hearing is suspended until further notice." As Cade swept Lila into his arms with gentle strength, preparing to carry her from the courthouse, an unexpected voice rose from the front row. "Wait." Reverend Isaiah Mercer stood slowly, his tall frame commanding immediate attention. "Before you go, there are things that must be said, things this court needs to hear." Thomas turned eagerly toward the preacher, clearly expecting support for his cause. "Reverend Mercer, thank you for coming. I'm sure you'll help this court understand the true nature of—" "Be silent," Isaiah commanded with the authority that had silenced congregations for decades. "You forfeited any right to speak about my daughter when you abandoned her in her hour of need." The courthouse fell into absolute stillness, everyone straining to hear what the preacher would say next. Another contraction gripped Lila, but she managed to remain conscious as her father approached the bench. "Your Honor," Isaiah said, his voice carrying across the room with practiced projection, "I have come here today not to support Mr. Whitmore's claims, but to confess my own sins before this community and before God." He turned to face the packed courtroom, his eyes finding Lila's for the first time in months. "I stand before you as a man who preached love while showing none to his own child, who spoke of forgiveness while harboring judgment in his heart, who valued his reputation more than his daughter's welfare." Thomas started to protest, but Isaiah's raised hand silenced him immediately. "When my daughter needed me most, I cast her out like refuse," the preacher continued, his voice breaking with emotion. "I gave her to Mr. Rawlins not out of concern for her welfare, but to preserve my own standing in this community. I failed as a father and as a Christian." He moved closer to where Cade held Lila, his weathered hands trembling as he reached toward them both. "But Cade Rawlins succeeded where I failed. He saw my daughter's worth when I could see only my own shame. He offered her safety when I offered only judgment. He gave her love when I gave her nothing but cold duty. Another contraction seized Lila, more intense than the last, and Cade shifted her carefully in his arms. "Reverend, we need to—" "One moment more," Isaiah said urgently. "Mr. Whitmore, you speak of rights and claims, but what claim does a man have who flees when faced with responsibility? What right to fatherhood belongs to someone who leaves a woman to bear shame alone?" He turned back to the judge, his voice gaining strength. "Your Honor, I have witnessed the marriage between my daughter and Cade Rawlins these past weeks. I have seen how he cares for her, how she has flourished under his protection. This is no fraud or deception, this is love, pure and simple. The kind of love I should have shown my daughter, but was too proud to give." The simple gold wedding band on Lila's finger caught the light streaming through the courthouse windows as another contraction racked her body. She looked at her father through tears of pain and unexpected hope, seeing for the first time in months the man who had raised her rather than the cold stranger who had cast her out. "I ask this court," Isaiah concluded, his voice now thick with emotion, "to recognize what I was too blind to see, that my daughter has found not just a husband, but a true partner. That the child she carries will be raised by parents who chose each other freely and love each other deeply." Judge Carmichael looked around the courtroom, taking in the faces of the community members who had witnessed this unexpected testimony. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of both legal authority and human compassion. "In light of the testimony presented and the immediate circumstances," he announced, "this court finds no evidence of fraud or coercion in the marriage between Mr. and Mrs. Rawlins. The union is declared valid in all respects, and Mr. Whitmore's petition is denied." Thomas shot to his feet, his face flushed with anger and disbelief. "This is outrageous. You can't—" "Furthermore," the judge continued, his voice cutting through Thomas's protests, "this court warns Mr. Whitmore that any further harassment of the Rawlins family will result in legal consequences. Your parental claims, such as they were, ended when you abandoned your responsibilities." As if in celebration of the verdict, Lila's body announced that the baby would wait no longer. Her cry of pain mixed with relief echoed through the courthouse, and Cade didn't wait for further permission before carrying her toward the door. "Dr. Morrison," he called over his shoulder, "we'll need your help." "Right behind you," the doctor replied, gathering his medical bag with practiced efficiency. As they left the courthouse, Lila caught one last glimpse of Thomas's defeated face and her father's expression of profound regret mixed with hope for redemption. The legal battle was over, but the most important part of her journey was just beginning, the moment when she would finally hold her child in her arms, free from shame and surrounded by love. 6 hours later, as the first stars appeared in the mountain sky, Elizabeth Sarah Rawlins took her first breath in the bedroom, where her mother had found refuge and love. She was perfect in every way that matter-written tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, and a voice that announced her arrival with indignant vigor. Dr. Morrison, who had delivered half the babies in cold mercy, declared her the healthiest infant he had seen in months. Cade held his daughter with the reverent care of a man who understood he was holding a miracle. His large, work-roughened hands looked impossibly gentle, cradling the tiny bundle, and when Elizabeth wrapped her miniature fingers around his thumb, Lila saw tears glisten in his dark eyes. "She's beautiful," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Perfect." "She looks like you," Lila said, though she knew it was probably too early to make such determinations. What she really meant was that Elizabeth already showed signs of the quiet strength that defined the man who would raise her as his own daughter. The handmade cradle that had waited so patiently in the corner of their room finally served its purpose, lined with soft blankets that Mrs. Patterson had brought during the long afternoon of labor. Elizabeth settled into it, as if she had always belonged there, which, Lila reflected, she had. The days that followed blurred together in the sweet exhaustion that comes with new parenthood. Cade proved to be a devoted father, rising for nighttime feedings without complaint, and learning to change diapers with the same careful attention he brought to every task. He would stand by the cradle for long minutes just watching Elizabeth sleep, and Lila often caught him talking to her in low, gentle tones about the ranch, the animals, and the life she would grow up knowing. "She'll need to learn to ride before she can properly walk," he told Elizabeth one morning as he changed her diaper with practiced efficiency. "Can't live on a ranch without knowing horses. And we'll teach her about the garden too, how to make things grow, how to be patient with the seasons." Lila watched these interactions with a contentment so complete it sometimes took her breath away. This was what family looked like, not the cold duty she had known in her father's house, but the warm partnership she and Cade had built together. Elizabeth would grow up understanding that love was shown through daily kindnesses, through steadfast presence, through choosing to stay when staying was difficult. 3 weeks after Elizabeth's birth, her grandfather came calling. Reverend Isaiah Mercer arrived on a Sunday afternoon, his hands twisting his hat brim as he stood awkwardly on the front porch. He looked older than Lila remembered, as if the weight of his regrets had aged him more than mere time. "I was wondering," he said carefully, "if I might meet my granddaughter." Lila and Cade exchanged glances, both remembering the cold stranger who had given her away like unwanted property. But they also remembered the broken man who had stood before the courthouse and confessed his failures to the entire community. "She's sleeping," Lila said, stepping aside to let him enter. "But you're welcome to see her." Isaiah followed them to the bedroom where Elizabeth lay in her cradle, one tiny fist pressed to her cheek in the complete abandon of infant slumber. For several minutes, he simply stood there, his eyes drinking in every detail of the granddaughter he had almost lost through his own pride. "She's perfect," he whispered finally, echoing Cade's words from that first night. "Absolutely perfect. Would you like to hold her?" Lila offered, and the hope that flickered in her father's eyes reminded her of the man who had once read her bedtime stories and taught her to fish in the creek behind the parsonage. Isaiah held Elizabeth with the careful reverence of a man who understood he was being given an undeserved gift. When she stirred and opened her eyes, fixing him with that unfocused but intense gaze that newborns possessed, his composure finally cracked. "I'm sorry," he said, the words directed at Elizabeth but meant for them all. "I'm so sorry for everything, for failing your mother when she needed me most, for valuing my pride over my daughter's welfare, for almost missing the chance to know you." "We all make mistakes, Reverend," Cade said quietly. "What matters is what we do next." What Isaiah did next was surprising in its humility. He began visiting regularly, not as the righteous preacher dispensing judgment, but as a grandfather eager to be part of his granddaughter's life. He helped with the garden harvest, shared stories of Lila's mother that brought tears and laughter in equal measure, and gradually rebuilt the relationship with his daughter that his pride had nearly destroyed. Thomas Whitmore, meanwhile, had left Cold Mercy immediately after the court hearing and had not been heard from since. Attorney Brennan had returned to Denver, presumably to find clients with more promising cases. The town itself seemed to have collectively decided that the Rawlins family deserved the same respect accorded to any other established ranch family in the valley. On a crisp October morning, when Elizabeth was 2 months old and the aspen trees had turned the mountainsides to gold, Lila stood in her wildflower garden holding her daughter. The flowers had grown beyond her wildest expectations, creating a natural meadow that attracted butterflies and birds in delightful abundance. Elizabeth seemed fascinated by the dancing butterflies, her eyes tracking their movement with the intense concentration only babies could achieve. "Look there, little one," Lila whispered, pointing to a monarch butterfly that had landed on a nearby stem. "Beautiful things can grow from the smallest beginnings." Cade emerged from the barn where he had been tending to a horse with a minor injury, and the sight of his 2 girls, surrounded by flowers, made him stop in his tracks. This was the family he had never dared hope, for the love that had grown from what others saw as punishment into something more precious than gold. "What are you thinking about?" Lila asked as he joined them in the garden. "Just counting my blessings," he replied, wrapping his arms around both of them. Thinking about how sometimes the best things come when you least expect them. Elizabeth chose that moment to take her first tentative steps, wobbling between her parents with the determined concentration of someone tackling a great adventure. As she collapsed into Cade's waiting arms with a delighted giggle, Lila realized that this was what redemption looked like, not a single dramatic moment, but the accumulation of countless small choices to love, to stay, to build something beautiful together. The woman who had once been handed over as punishment had become the queen of her own small kingdom, ruling not through power, but through the quiet sovereignty of a life built on love, respect, and the knowledge that some gifts come disguised as burdens until we learn to see them clearly.